Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's meeting of the Scrutiny Commission. As usual, this meeting is broadcast live to the public. For those not able to watch live, the webcast will be recorded and made available for viewing on the County Council's website after the meeting. Due to continued restrictions, we are still limited with the number of people we can have in the room, and therefore some of the officers who are presenting reports will be joining the meeting virtually, as will those lead members that have been invited for specific items. For their benefit and for those watching the webcasts, can I please ask members to briefly introduce themselves?
Councillor Trevor Pendleton, Castle Donington and Kegworth Ward.
Good morning, Councillor Rosita Page, Lutterworth Division and Vice Chairman of this panel.
Good morning, Councillor Tom Barclay. I'm Councillor Syston Ridgeway.
Good morning, Councillor James Poland, Syston Foss.
Good morning, Councillor Jonathan Morgan, Loughborough South West.
Good morning, Councillor Terry Richardson, representing Narborough and Western Division. Good
morning, David Beale, representing Hinckley Hollycroft.
Good morning, Councillor Hilary Fryer, representing Quorn and Barrow upon the Soar.
Good morning, Max Hunt, representing Loughborough North West.
Councillor Deborah Taylor, representing Bradgate.
Thank you, everyone, and Councillor Michael Mullaney, Hinckley de Montfort and Chair of the Scrutiny Commission. Just to advise of one substitute today, which is David Bill is in attendance in the usual place of Mr. Simon Galton. So the first item on the agenda is the minutes from the last meeting. I'll move that the minutes of the meeting that were held on the 9th of June 2021 are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Is that agreed by members? Mr. Richardson?
Yeah, if I just raise a question, Chair, on page 13, it's the recommendations on there, if I can quickly find it. Yeah, and it's probably confusion. So the resolution under B, perfectly understand that's what's been agreed for future years. I think my understanding and that of the majority of my colleagues was that the figures for the year we were discussing would also be provided within 4 weeks of the last Scrutiny Commission meeting. Now, if that wasn't clear, I think that's probably our fault more than anyone else's. I did briefly mention it to the portfolio holder this morning. He's happy for those figures to be provided. So could we just have it minuted in these new minutes that much as the resolution under B, we're perfectly happy is correct, it didn't go as far as we felt it was going to do to give us retrospective information that was requested at the meeting.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Richardson, but obviously we will be getting that information from the relevant portfolio.
We hope so. Hopefully Chris is nodding at me, so yes.
Good, excellent. Mr. Richardson, agenda item 2 is question time. I've not been advised of any questions from the public. So agenda item 3 is questions asked by members under standing order number 7. Again, I've not been advised of any such questions. Agenda item 4, I've not been advised of any urgent items. So we move on to agenda item 5, which is the declarations of interest. Do any members have any interest they wish to declare? Mr. Richardson?
Thank you, Chairman. I wish to make a declaration as a LEP board director. Thank you.
And Mr. Morgan?
Thank you, Chair. I also will make a declaration as a LEP board director relevant to item 11.
Mr. Poland?
Thank you, Chairman. It's probably me being cautious here, but item 5, the police and crime one, my wife works for Leicestershire Police, but not the office of the Police and Crime Commissioner.
Okay, and Mrs. Page?
Yes, and I would just like for the record to put the standard declaration for all district councillors, and if we can please keep that noted for all future items. Thank you.
Mrs. Page? Item 6 declarations of the party whip. Do any members wish to declare the party whip? No. Item 7, we've not received any petitions. So item 8, moving on then now to our first substantive item, which is an update on police and crime panel activity from the County Council's representative on the panel, lead member Mrs. Deborah Taylor. And some slides prepared by Mrs. Taylor are available within the agenda pack at pages 15 to 22. Scrutiny Commission is the crime and disorder body for the County Council, so we have partly responsibility for this, and we are here to work with the panel and scrutinise the work of the panel and work with them, which is the reason Mrs. Taylor's here today. So, Mrs. Taylor, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as you'll see from the slides, this is the police and crime panel update from 2020 to 2021. Just to clarify before I start, I wasn't chair of the panel during that period. I've just took over the panel in the last few weeks. So this is a report from the previous chair. So during the 2020-21, the panel held 6 public meetings, and obviously they were all held virtually due to the pandemic. We continue to receive quarterly reports on the performance of the police force and also the work of the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner. As I'm sure we're all aware, it's been a really exceptional year with the pandemic, and many of the crime types have generally seen a decrease, but we have seen an increase in other crimes connected more with people being at home a lot more. So overall crime has gone down, so it shows a reduction of 5.7% compared to the same quarter in the previous year. You've just got the performance up to Q3 at the moment. So violence with injury during the quarter has also seen a decrease, but I think as things start to come out of lockdown, we will be keeping a close eye on whether there's been an increase in that sort of injuries and violence. And violence without injury has increased by 5.7%. I think it's helpful to really understand what those categories include, because I think when we talk about violence with injury, that can just mean a red mark compared to actually sticking a knife in someone. So that it's quite a wide criteria of what fits into each category. So it's probably important that people understand what that means. Knife offences have remained fairly stable. So the quarterly comparison shows a 14.8 increase in knife crimes, however, a visible decrease in December 2020, obviously when we went back into another lockdown. And as I've just mentioned, domestic abuse offences increased by 30%, and I think that's really significant increase, but obviously down to people being at home a lot more. But it is a decrease from offences seen in November 2019. So, you know, it's a bit of a mixed picture, that one, but something that the panel will keep a close eye on. Burglary offences decreased, obviously with everyone being at home a lot more, but hate offences did increase a lot more, and I think that was mainly due to the pandemic and things like that. So the panel looked at the budget in January 2021, and they did include it. It did increase the precept by £15 for Band D property, and that was quite a large increase. And I think the panel's overall view was it was a very heavy heart that they did increase that, but they only approved it due to the fact that it was going to actually go towards additional police officers on the beat, which I think is what a lot of residents are saying to us, is that what they want to see. They want to see visible police. So that increase in PSEP will help us with an additional 50 officers to be supported through those funds, along with the Home Office increase of 88 officers. So hopefully we'll see a lot more police on the streets and working hard for us. And we are on the panel, have heard from the Chief Constable that we are on plan to recruit those officers. So the total cost of the Office for the Police and Crime Commissioner is 1.4 million, which is a net increase of 70k from 2021. And I do know the new commissioner that's just took over is looking into that and seeing whether we can, if that's needed, or whether we can make some further cuts to staffing and put some funding elsewhere. So I know that's quite high on his agenda at the moment since he's come into place. So that's something he's looking at. And 97.3% of that net budget is allocated to the Chief Constable for use on local policing. So the elections were postponed in May 2021 for the new Police and Crime Commission. They were held in May 2021. So as you know, Rupert Matthews was elected, and Lord Baxter down after his extended term of 5 years. And I think the panel were paid their their thanks to Lord Back for his hard work over the past 5 years, and that was put down in the minutes of the last meeting we have. So the new Police and Crime Commissioner will be looking at producing a new police and crime plan, and at the last meeting where I took over as chair, I've offered the Police and Crime Commissioner a working group from the panel to help him work through that police and crime plan so we can understand what residents actually want from the police. So that first meeting is going to take place this week, and we'll be working closely alongside the police and crime panel, and that's across party and cross LLR as well, people that are on that panel. So there's information there about the statutory functions of the panel. I won't read through all that. It's very clear on your slides there of what our function is. And really adding value is what the panel's about, is to scrutinise the work of the Police and Crime Commissioner, and obviously he holds the police constable to account. So overall we have an overview from the police and the PCC. But looking forward to a hard year of work. I think it's going to be very different as we come out of the pandemic. I think there's going to be some lot of different crimes that come forefront that have laid quite dormant for the last year. So there's a lot of work to do. But first of all, we need to get the Police and Crime Commissioner settled into his new role, let him find his feet and get the new police and crime plan up and running, and then we can go from there. So hopefully this time next year, there'll be a lot more to bring to you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Taylor. I have, in terms of members wishing to speak, I've so far Mr. Morgan, Mrs. Page, Mr. Bill, Mr. Pendleton and Mr. Poland. Is there any other members at the moment? Okay, so to Mr. Morgan, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. So really, this is a question about where this paper actually sits within this commission. Clearly, as Mr. Taylor has just outlined, the Police and Crime Panel is a scrutiny body of the Police and Crime Commissioner. We are obviously a scrutiny body scrutinising a scrutiny committee that is scrutinising an official. It seems possible that possibly there's a little bit too much scrutiny going on, given the fact that we are duplicating a scrutiny function that is already part of a statutory requirement. And the question is, given that I understand that the City Council do not scrutinise the Police and Crime Commission panel, whether it's necessarily appropriate that we are scrutinising a scrutiny body that is scrutinising a statutory position. So really just a request to make sure, if this is an update, I wonder whether actually this should be an update to full council for information rather than actually to a scrutiny body, or if this is actually a scrutiny of a scrutiny body, whether actually the scrutiny of a scrutiny body of a scrutiny of an official statutory position is necessarily overkill.
I'll do my best.
Mr. Morgan.
On that one. The Scrutiny Commission has been designated the Crime and Disorder Committee. Every local authority has to have one. So that's the capacity in which we are hearing from Mrs. Taylor as the representative on the Police and Crime Panel. You are correct that the Police and Crime Panel is the body that scrutinises the Police and Crime Commissioner, but as the County Council has certain responsibilities itself, you as the Scrutiny Committee can raise certain issues, and we feed those through Mrs. Taylor as the County Council's representative to then bring up through the panel. We do actually, I think, have a protocol from when the panel first was established to sort of set out and try and clarify what appears to be very similar roles for this body, and I can get that circulated with a bit of more information for everybody. But I think the intention is if you have any issues that, based on Mrs. Taylor's presentation or otherwise that you're aware of, we feed it through Mrs. Taylor and she can bring it through the panel. And if there's anything the Commission specifically wanted to look at after that, then we can have that conversation with the Commissioners after this meeting. Probably doesn't help too much, but I'll get the protocol circulated and that might help a little bit. Okay.
Thank you, Joanne. Did you want to come back to that, Deborah, before we move on?
Yeah, I kind of agree with Mr. Morgan that that does seem overkill of scrutiny. I mean, I think, because I haven't seen that protocol, so for me as chair of the Police and Crime Panel, that would be quite helpful to see that, to know what I should be bringing here and what the Scrutiny Commission is interested in. But I suppose for me, this panel needs to be careful that they're not scrutinising the performance of the office and of the Police and Crime Commissioner, because that's the panel's role. So I think that the clarity of roles is very important to add any benefit, because we don't want to have scrutiny for the sake of scrutiny. It needs to add value.
Thank you, Mrs. Taylor, and Mrs. Page.
Thank you, and that is very much on the same theme. Now, through you, Chairman, and Joe, may I suggest that we put together a small paper that sets out the process, the protocol, our remit, and our responsibilities going forward. And then we're all very clear, especially with moving into a new administration. We can then either circulate it to all members. I think that will probably be the easiest way, as part of a briefing, if that is agreed with you, Chairman, because then we are quite clear. My other question, well, that was a comment really, wasn't it? My question is in relation to the police and crime plan. When do we see that coming forward? And we normally have that also coming to the Scrutiny Commission, if I remember rightly. So when would that be coming through you, Chairman? Joe, do we know? And what is our remit on that, and how does that process work? So can we have also a steer on that if we have a briefing? Because, you know, we are talking over several authorities. So if we are sending Councillor Taylor forward with our comments, she might be put in a position to be said, well, sorry, you know, that is not your remit. But if she is quite clear and she has got that authority, she can speak with that little bit more authority. So if we can set all of that out, it would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Page. Mrs. Taylor.
At the last panel, the Police and Crime Commissioner, obviously I've set out, I offered him the support of a small working group from the Police and Crime panel. So we're meeting this week. So that is looking to put the Police and Crime plan together over the summer to hopefully go out for consultation after that. So it will go out to public consultation, so everyone will have the opportunity to feed into that as well, and hoping to get it in place by the end of the year at the very latest. But I think his ambition is to get it done as soon as possible, but obviously it will take some time to work through and look at the priorities.
Thank you, Mrs. Taylor. Mr. Pendleton next.
Thank you, Chairman. I noted on the very full overview that Deborah gave us that the Police and Crime Commissioner is, of course, going to set course and the course for the whole of our police in Leicester and Leicestershire. Could I ask, in view of the fact that the previous but one Police and Crime Commissioner did in his reports have KPIs, that she encouraged the present new PCC to actually do that as well, because otherwise how will he know what success looks like, and how will we know what success looks like? It was very difficult with the last PCC to actually judge how successful he was in an objective sense. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Pendleton. Mrs. Taylor.
Thank you. And I just add in that you forgot Rutland within that. We must remember it's Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, just to be clear. So
I defer to you.
Yeah, I think obviously I wasn't really involved with the first Police and Crime Commission. I wasn't even an elected member at that point, so I don't have much recollection of that. But the last Lord Willyback really didn't have any KPIs at all, but had stats, which I personally found very difficult to understand. And I was grateful for Councillor Phillimore, who is an excellent statistician, to explain to me precisely what the stats meant, but I found them very difficult to understand. So I can definitely take that back as we're working with the Police and Crime Commissioner through his Police and Crime plan to request that is put in there in some form for us to be able to scrutinise his work.
Thank you, Mrs. Taylor. I have Mr. Bill and Mr. Poland next. I think Mrs. Fryer, and are you wanting to speak as well, Mr. Richardson? Mr. Bill.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Chairman. I accept that what people are saying about the remoteness of the accountability. I find the whole system weird, having been a member of the police committee and the police authority when we actually held the whole police force to account. But there we are. We're at the end of the line asking questions, and I'm looking really at the statutory role which Deborah has set out for us. That is to challenge the PCC on matters of current interest and concern. Well, can I raise the matter which has hit the front of the Leicester Mercury in a big way? That is the relationship between the PCC and BLM, Black Lives Matter. Now, whatever we think of that particular organisation, there is a real danger, in my view, that if that there could be a breach of trust between the black community as a whole and the police, which I think would be a disastrous turn of events, because traditionally the police obviously are accountable to and responsible for the whole community, whoever they might be. Now, I'd just like to ask the question, can we please have a reassurance from the PCC and indeed the Chief Constable that the policing in Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland will be run in accordance with everybody in the community. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bill. Mrs. Taylor, did you want to make any comment?
I think that question needs to be directed to the Police and Crime Commissioner himself. I can't answer on his behalf, but we just need to separate out that the police and the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner are two different organisations, and not to confuse those two.
Mr. Poland.
Thank you, Chair. The PCC has recently said that by 2024, the OPCC will be £11 million in deficit, as well as being down to the legal minimum of reserves. To what extent did the Police and Crime Panel challenge the previous PCC as to the reasons for this? And did they take a view on whether committing money to projects against his successor's budget was reasonable, given the size of the financial problems the current PCC, Mr. Matthews, is now facing and will be facing over the coming years?
Mrs. Taylor.
Thank you. I think the Police and Crime Commissioner made a statement at the end of the last panel to make us aware of the issues within the budget. From my view, I obviously wasn't chair of that when the precept went through, but I think there was really good scrutiny of that budget and what it was going to pay for. And I think the view was that we needed to get more police officers back on and up their numbers. So that was the reason that the precept was supported. But no, I take on board your points, and there will be a lot more scrutiny going on under my leadership of the budget going forward.
Thank you, Mrs. Taylor. Mrs. Fryer.
Thank you very much. I really endorse mostly what has already been said by my fellow councillors. It is a tricky situation that and I think for us to get the paperwork sent through to us of our actual duties is good. I think also, and I'm sure Mrs. Taylor will be pushing through the panel, will be pushing the Police and Crime Commissioner. The last Police and Crime Commissioner was actually Commissioner for 5 years instead of 4. This Police and Crime Commissioner, sadly, is only for 3, which means a very, very difficult job for him, or whoever was going to be Police and Crime Commissioner. I'm quite surprised that his term of office has been reduced through no fault of the police or anybody else, because everybody knows it takes such a lot of time to get things in motion and to get plans underway. So my point is that I think this council, this committee, and everybody else must support the new Police and Crime Commissioner, be perfectly sensible and logical, and not ask for things that in 3 years just cannot be achieved. We've got to give targets, and he will be given targets that are achievable in the short time he's got. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Fryer. Mrs. Taylor.
From my personal point of view, I share those concerns as well, and I know a lot of the police and crime commissioners across the country are lobbying government to make the term 4 years from this time, because as I just said, the current PCC's police and crime plan is not even going to be in place till sort of towards the end of this year, so that only leaves just over 2 years to put that in place, and it's just not long enough to get any substantial work done. So I will be definitely supporting, I think the panel is as well, in lobbying government to get the term extended to 4 years.
Thank you, Mrs. Taylor. I have Mr. Richardson, Mr. Hunt and Mrs. Page again, just for a final call. Does anyone else wish to make any comments, questions before then? Okay, so over to Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. Probably just a comment really, which I hope will assist Mrs. Taylor, is that at a meeting here, it must be 3 years ago now, it's always difficult to remember with COVID, when Lord Back was here, I raised a question at that meeting about earmarked reserves, which were held by the police, because they had an earmarked reserve on their balance sheet of 23 million, which didn't actually seem to equate to anything. Following that meeting, I was invited to attend a meeting with Lord Back and his chief financial officer at police headquarters, where it was agreed that the 23 million wasn't actually earmarked for anything and could be released, and should have been released 2 years previously, to put extra police on the beat rather than take them off. So I'll just urge Mrs. Taylor to look closely at those earmarked reserves to see particularly if that one has been spent on bringing police officers back to the front line, which is what we all want. And it was a shame really that that money had been sitting there for several years at a time when we were cutting police officers, when the funds were available to actually retain them.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson.
And I'll just reiterate the comment that I made earlier. There will be a robust scrutiny of the budget under my leadership going forward.
And Mr. Hunt.
Thanks. Just a couple of final comments. I understand the concern there is about the multiplicity of scrutiny, and the point that Rosita made about looking at it more deeply. It's something that was invented, I think, in a bit of a hurry, the police commissioner role, in political terms rather than in functional ones. And I have to say, having served with David on the police, and what did we call it? The police authority, as it was in those days, that worked extremely well. It wasn't politically led in any way, and it had the benefit of very senior, if not superannuated, public servants who contributed hugely to that, and also I think kept councillors on message, if you like, with the chief constable. The present system risks any singular cranky ideas coming forward, and I think that might be what David was referring to. I've read something on the social media which wasn't very encouraging, so I wish the police and crime panel the best of luck in the next 3 years. My personal view on the subject matter, apart from the finance, obviously important, is that the business, if you can call it that, seems to usually fall between crimes of property and crimes on the person. And in the statistics that we've been given, it's crimes on the person that seem to be, I would say, rocketing. And bearing in mind that crimes in property are easily detectable, crimes on the person, you know, who is finally evidenced against in a domestic or neighbour or community matter, are much more difficult to detect, and therefore, if anything, they're underrated rather than overrated. But that's where I would like to see the Police and Crime Commission Police and Crime panel focused its attention on crimes of the person and detections thereof. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hunt. Mrs. Taylor.
Thank you. That's something that can be fed back to the Police Council because that's more operational than for the police rather than the Office of Police and Crime Commission. But we can definitely feed that back through the panel. There is a review, a national review that the government's undertaking now of the role of the Police and Crime panel. So Leicestershire, Leicester and Rutland panel have fed into that review with our thoughts on how it works. So I know it needs to be refreshed and re-looked at and see whether it's serving its purpose. So I do welcome that review. So we'll see what comes of that review as well. Just about the scrutiny, you know, this is we're only responsible for the county, and this is an LLR. So if there needs to be scrutiny of the Police and Crime panel, maybe we should be looking at that's across LLR rather than just sitting with the county. So that might be something that we can look at going forward. So it's across, you know, the three authorities. But no, I'll take on board obviously the reduction in crime on properties because everyone's in their properties. They're not been left empty for the last 18 months, are they? But as things start to open up and more, I'm sure we will see an alteration of crimes, where they happen and what sort of crimes. But that's something we'll keep a close eye on.
Thank you, Mrs. Taylor. Mrs. Page.
Thank you. Mrs. Taylor just answered some of my queries, and I was so just a couple of comments. As I've requested earlier on, an update on the process and, you know, procedure, etc. Could we probably add the review of the panels in there just a little bit to make it a little bit more wholesome? Thank you very much for that. Now, going back on the very difficult job the new PCC has, and noting a previous budget overspend, and us having, what was it, 11 million shortage. I think going forward, there will be an awful lot of pressures, in particular, as most of our residents noted, that there was this beginning of the year, I think, a £15 charge to the police. Being a member who represents a rural area, it would be amiss if I don't mention the rural areas. And whilst I appreciate that budgets follow crime and budgets are there for prevention, rural areas always feel left out. So there is a plea from me to Councillor Taylor that when we are looking at a new police and crime plan, that hopefully there are clear, tangible outcomes and that it is very well communicated, so we don't going into an area where where rural areas will end up being attacking us for not having the right services there, that there is the right communication that goes out alongside the plan. And hopefully she will also lobby for rural areas to have the fair share of resources. And thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mrs. Page. Mrs. Taylor? Oh.
Forgot to say, can we get the sound turned up a bit, because again here we can't really, we can hear that far, but we can't hear Mrs. Taylor very clearly, or whoever the speaker is over there. So if we can just get it turned up a bit, Joe, is that possible? Thank you.
I'll make an inquiry.
Cheers.
Don't worry, Rosita, I'll be near you next time. Don't worry. You'll be able to hear me loud and clear. Yeah, no, I will feed that. Like I said, we've got a working party working with the PCC on his crime plan. So I'll definitely take that point and feed that into that working group. Thank you.
Thank you today to Mrs. Taylor for coming and answering everyone's questions, and for everybody for their questions and contributions and comments. It's appreciated. And item 9 is we have the 20 to 21 provisional revenue and capital outturn, which is at pages 23 to 66 of the agenda pack. Chris Tambini, the Director of Resources, is with us for this item. And we also have Declan Keegan, Assistant Director, who's joining us online. We also have the lead member for Resources, Mr. Brecken, joining us online as well. Welcome, Mr. Brecken. And can we just check that you and Declan can hear us both okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I can hear you fine, Chair.
Thank you. Right, so if we start, is it Chris beginning?
Declan's going to take us through the report.
Okay.
Thanks, Chris. So the members' benefit, the report covers the revenue and capital outturn for the last financial year and the final position on our earmarked funds. So this was reported to Cabinet back in June for approval. So we last came to the Scrutiny Committee in period 10 when we were reporting a revenue underspend of £4 million, which is now increased to £10 million. And at period 10 also capital slippage was showing £34 million, and that's increased a little bit to £41 million. So what was intended to do was just talk through the revenue section first, take a pause for Chris and then lead member may have some comments, and then sort of take questions and then go through the earmarked funds, do the same again, and then go through the capital if that works okay. So looking at the revenue position, the position's obviously evolved over the course of this last year. Before the summer, we were very much concerned that we're going to need to dip into the general fund due to the sort of lack of government support for COVID. So we did instigate a review of the sort of capital and programme and restricted sort of payments to suppliers, so they were only focusing on those that were continuing to deliver services. Then as the sort of the year went on into the autumn, the position for the this last financial year, sorry, getting my years mixed up, did start to look more manageable. We were getting increasingly concerned for 2021-22. So hence we introduced some spending controls to start to manage that sort of cash position. But by the winter, when we were setting the MTFS, we were actually able then to start to direct resources to the 21-22 problem. But government actually started to turn on the funding taps, as it were, and they turned them on quite a lot. We probably sort of got more funding in the sort of the final quarter of the year than we did in probably the 3 quarters before that. And that was money was sort of came in at a quicker rate than we were able to spend on COVID. And so what we ended up with is a combination really of kind of spending controls, government funding substituting sort of our base spend, but also kind of COVID meaning that other activities couldn't happen, that started to drive the underspend and allowed us the earmarked funds to be built to allow that preparation for 21-22. So it isn't, so give that bit of background really why it's been such an unusual year. But if we do step away from the temporary factors that have hit the last financial year and continue to some extent, the underlying funding pressures are still there in terms of low funding and service demand, and they're likely to be exacerbated more than anything else by the ongoing impacts of COVID. I won't go through the revenue section sort of line by line, but I'll just pick out the main kind of main handful of areas that sort of driving the variances. So the first sort of section we tend to talk to is the sort of the schools block, and it's split into two. We've got the schools and the funding that we hold for or distribute on behalf of them, but also the high needs. And the schools is showing a kind of a bit of an underspend, £3 million compared to the grant that's in there. And we've been building that up for a few years to deal with sort of growth in schools, so that the first year that a school launches, the grant that they get, because it's based on historic information, doesn't cover the cost of the schoolhouse. So that reserve's held and distributed sort of in alignment with the schools forum to hit the right place. And it is earmarked from that due to the forecast acceleration in the number of sort of school places that are coming in. That growth, that reserve is all seen as being needed. But on the flip side, we've got the high needs, which has been our biggest problem for quite a while, and that's now showing a £10 million overspend, which is increasing our kind of the amount of sort of deficit that we've got against this grant, just shy of £18 million. And that is real cash. You know, there's some funny notions go around like negative reserves and things like that, but at the end of the day, it is cash in there. And there was a paper on this sort of the cabinet agenda, and if members haven't already, I would sort of urge you to have a bit of a look at it on high needs, and it does show the position on there quite well, but it also shows the position is getting worse despite the fact that government have been increasing the level of grant that they've been contributing to the extent by the end of this MTFS period we expect to have got £43 million tied up in the high needs problem, which is an increase on £10 million when we set the MTFS, and we only set the MTFS, or it was only agreed back in February, so it's a real big problem for us. Members will also have picked up that government has written off deficits of some authorities, which it does leave you to sort of that how much you invest your own capital resources versus how much you wait for government hit to sort of come along. But it has been a very small number of authorities that have helped out, and actually the size of their deficits, ours would have to more than double before we were in that kind of category. The other thing we've been waiting for on high needs is the reforms, but there's no sign of anything kind of concrete or helpful in that area yet. The next area the report goes into is the Children's and Family Services, and the position has slightly improved compared to period 10, and it's now sitting about sort of £4 million. I would remind members that we did put just shy of £9 million of growth in the MTFS to sort of help children's accommodate the kind of the growth that they've been seeing. So it's kind of, although there's an overspend, there is kind of a significant increase in the sort of the budgets as well. And the driver is very much the kind of the placement position, and it's the cost of the placement rather than the number of placements that have been hit. And we've also got a continuing problem with sort of recruiting of social care staff, and it's kind of causing a reliance on agency workers, which brings additional costs with it. We do have a slight oddity in there that I just wanted to highlight to members. Supporting Leicestershire families, we've turned off the use of the reserve on that, and that's just purely because we've got no sight of government funding beyond the current year. So we wanted to make sure that kind of, there's an ongoing commitment there at the moment to that service. We just want to make sure the funding's there to just buy time to see what the sort of the government's intention is. And finally, in Children's and Families, there's a helpful underspend on the sort of the non-critical roles, about £1.4 million through vacancy controls, etc., which is very helpful position. But also for the first time, probably in about 5 years, asylum seeking budget is underspent quite significantly, £1 million, and the government has finally started to increase the level of support that goes into this area quite significantly. So, like I say, the first time that's turned from a pressure to an underspend. This report then goes into the Adults and Communities Department, and primarily adult social care dominates this, obviously. And we've got a £5.9 million overspend there, which is an improvement on the £7 million position that previously reported. And this has been the worst affected budget in terms of those temporary impacts of COVID. And this kind of probably break it down into 3 areas. One is the provider support that's had to go in there, and most of this has been provided by government, although there has been a significant amount of LCC resources as well. And this is about £30 million of government support over the course of the year. We've got NHS discharge, and obviously big concern here is about expectations, sort of difficult to manage once they've been set up. And this has been supported by £17 million of NHS funding through the year. And the final area that sort of hit adults compared to sort of a business as usual year is service user income. And the usual routines have been disrupted in terms of making those assessments of people, partly because of the sort of the rules around discharge, but partly the disruption of COVID. And it's going to take a bit of time for that to get back on track and potentially have to backdate some charges. So those three pressures very much sort of COVID related, but we're seeing those pressures continue as kind of providers are still looking for cost support, and we're seeing that through the sort of the fees that they're looking to charge for residents. People are still on the discharge packages. They've been taken out of hospital quicker than they would normally, and expectations sort of change, and we're still behind on charging. So we are seeing the adults pressures continuing through the course of this financial year. So a big concern then, because this could turn into an ongoing growth pressure or increase the ongoing growth pressures. The report gets into better news now, really. Public health, we've recorded is on budget. They are underspent a bit, about £1 million, but we just moved that into the earmarked fund, just reflecting the fact that the public health service has got an earmarked grant that you're not meant to use on other items. Environment and transport, quite a big underspend there that's increased just shy of £7 million, has grown from about £4 million at period 10. And the big element in there was transport. That's down by about 5 million, and usage is a lot lower on there. Again, a lot of the activities that we do the transporting for have dropped off over the course of COVID. Whether it's sort of school-related activity or the social care-related activities that do as day centres and things have been closed. But it's also coupled with the fact that we did decide to only to pay a retainer rather than the full rate for suppliers who were only sort of providing either a partial or no service at all. So, and that's kind of paid off financially. And the highways delivery staffing, you'll see an underspend there, about £1.5 million, and that's partly because extra government funding came in that meant the sort of the resources could go directly to doing these sort of funded schemes, but also there's been an element of vacancy control within there. Chief Exec's Department, shade over £1.5 million overspend, and this is primarily the community grant scheme. Members will be very familiar with that. It was launched at the start of the COVID pandemic and was quite successful. And there's also some other overspends in there, about £500,000 on legals that's been offset by other vacancies elsewhere in the department. Corporate resources is another area where there could, or there's like to be, ongoing impacts of COVID in here. So the overspend has increased to about £6 million. It was just shy of 5 million before. And the reason it's grown is because we haven't taken the funding from the transformation earmarked funds. This is the money we use for two purposes. One is to fund change within the council, but the other one is, well, actually it's all for change within the council, but one of it is for sort of direct delivery of projects, and some of it's for kind of severance costs, etc. And this is reflecting a handful of things. You know, we've got staff were diverted to help with the COVID response, whether it's actually the response itself or the recovery from it. So they weren't working on those savings initiatives. But we've also, obviously, kind of through COVID, we've also got, you know, an additional requirement to keep developing and delivering savings. So we're just making sure there's money aside for there. But finally, the government were going to introduce a cap on exit costs, but they've ended up dropping that cap, so that things are going to get more stay expensive as they were. We thought we were going to get a saving in there, so just making sure we don't run short there. But the main thing to be sort of aware of in corporate resources is the commercial service income that's taken quite a hit. So that's overspending just shy of £2 million. I mean, fortunately, that still does represent a break-even position, so it's not a burden on the council's finances yet, but it is break-even. And that the only reason it's breaking even is because of £3.5 million of government support, and this is really unusual for this type of services we deal with. We deal with sort of education, mainly, you know, school foods in that education setting. They're normally what you term a defensive sector, but not this time. So very unusual kind of recession, as it were, that impacts that type of service. And commercial services, you know, that there are going to be ongoing impacts of COVID. You know, Bow Manor Hall is still shut, so one to keep an eye on. And I'll touch on the asset investment fund because it picks the variance here, but it is done in a little bit more detail in the capital section later. So I'll talk about it a little bit more there, but it talks about a 1.4 million overspend. Again, worth bearing in mind that this is that's comparison to budget. It's still generated 4.6 million pounds of net revenue income, so still a very, very positive thing. It's just that there was some sort of delays within the scheme that's caused us to be behind on our income targets, and that was primarily the new building out at the Loughborough Science Park, the access building, and also at Airfield Farm as the main drivers. We've also sort of started to build a sinking fund for the corporate asset investment fund to just deal with longer term issues, end of lease refurbishments, things like that. But the underlying performance of the fund is very, very good, and like I say, we'll come on to it later. Rent was collected and voids have actually reduced, which is remarkable. And then the final bit of corporate resources is ICT investment in the working from home infrastructure, a real essential sort of part of COVID. In the sort of the central type areas, the capital financing is sort of a slight kind of odd one, sort of £5 million of kind of to supplement the programme, as we're requiring funding of the funding that we normally get from disposals dropped off, and this has been kind of like for the past few years. This has dropped away, so we've kind of just needing to supplement it with revenue. There's a few schemes will come later that have just taken longer, and because of the tight position we're on in financing, we need to make sure that the cash is there. And then the costs are also up on the kind of on the capital side of things. We've had to make a little bit of provision in there as well. What else have we got? So carrying on down, we've got kind of the general fund. You'll see the increase in there in the report, and that just reflects the SEND cash. I talked about the high needs before, and just need to make sure that is covered. And then moving into there's a few more oddities in that sort of central section. You'll see that kind of there's £5.5 million related to COVID. £1.5 million that is that system project delay, but £4 million is going to supplement the COVID budget. I talked in the intro a little bit about kind of needing to prepare for the current financial year, and that's been done more, just making sure we can sort of move a bit of money across to deal with the sort of problems that we're going to face this year. There is £5 million you'll see we've provided there for council tax being short. Members will have picked up a government scheme that covers 3/4 of the losses. Unfortunately, that's the headline. The reality is a little bit different, and the bizarre thing is there, it only kind of covers for growth in the council tax base, as it were. So if you've got bad debt on council tax, you know, if people aren't aren't paying. What government's saying is actually you'll get that at some point in the future, so it doesn't sort of compensate you for that. So fortunately, the furlough scheme has reduced unemployment from the forecast drastically, but the council tax scheme isn't great by any stretch of the imagination. So overall, that £10 million underspend, and just draw your attention to paragraph 73, just shows how that underspend's been allocated out to some of the kind of the priorities that were seen sort of at the time. So I take a pause there. I don't know whether the lead member or Chris has got any comments.
Thank you, Declan. Chris or Mr. Brecken, did you want to come in on the revenue section?
I think if I can, just for myself, it's thanks to Declan for just going past the first part of the revenue. I think last year we all know it was very tough. I think for all local authorities, certainly for this council. But I think it's fair to say that we responded very well. We continue to manage finances prudently and sensibly, and I think that's down to the good work of the officers that we have at County Council. I also think it's fair to say that we face a challenging financial position over the coming years, and I think as we move away from the COVID battle, as that's won, I think historically we will still have issues to face. We're not complacent. We're looking at the funding issues talked about many years, but yeah, we are working hard to address these. I think the fair funding and the levelling up agenda is needed. I think it's now being realised down in London that we do need this, and I think there's some good work going on there. So I think I wouldn't offer anything other than that at the moment. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Brecken. Chris, did you want to come in before we throw it open to members?
Yeah, just a couple of words, just kind of echoing what Lee said, actually. I mean, the thing that concerns me is the, I suppose, the pre-pandemic pressures are still there, and if anything, they're growing. So that is a big issue. That I'm sure that will flow in, when it is flowing into this year in terms of the monitoring position. So you kind of got pressures around SEN, which I know members are familiar with. You've got social care, both children and adults, which are key pressures, and we'll come on to in a little while. But you also got pressures on the capital programme. So there are a lot of pressures that are flowing into this year, and they'll also influence next year's budget setting as well.
Thank you, Chris. So we're looking at questions, comments up to page 33 of the paperwork for revenue issues. I've got Mrs. Fryer down, Mr. Richardson, no, not Mrs. Fryer, Mr. Richardson and Mr. Barclay. Anyone else at the moment? Okay, Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to think that everybody in this chamber agrees that the Corporate Asset Investment Fund has been a great success and revenue provider for this council. What I'm really interested in is, and I know we got some useful figures, and I appreciate, apologies for going to page 45 because some of the revenue figures are shown on page 43 rather. So I'm not leaping into capital side in case anyone has a go at me. What I'm interested in is the percentage of non-performing assets we've got and what non-performing assets we've got. So, you know, at a time when the council is clearly, you know, I won't say struggling, but is clearly looking to make every penny count. What I never get a flavour on is the value and volume of non-performing assets, and therefore are there areas, you know, that we might or should be looking to dispose of at a greater rate to increase the amount of funds we got available to increase that revenue return.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Does Declan or Chris want to come back on that?
If I kick off, and then I'll see if Declan wants to kind of add anything. In terms of the Corporate Asset Investment Fund, I mean, all the assets are performing. But what I would say that if you look at the returns, say from the agricultural estate, they're probably the more non-performing ones. But to be honest, because a lot of those ones end up getting planning permission or some kind of uplift at a later stage, we hold them for the long term with the fact that we're going to get some kind of benefit in terms of significant capital uplift at that stage. I mean, the CAIF, I suppose, it wouldn't really contain non-performing assets, but I suppose if you look across the whole kind of base of the county council, there are more kind of non-income earning assets, but clearly most of those are there for a service benefit. But we're constantly reviewing them and looking at them, and those that are non-performing that we don't need, we generally will sell or look to repurpose for another kind of service. I don't know whether you want to add anything, Declan.
The only bit I was going to add was a few years ago we did dispose of a few of the sort of the historic industrial estate that was sort of in that sort of category of non-performing, where the buildings had kind of got old and you were struggling to get tenants. So one of them, I think it's Workspace 17 they call it, which makes it sound very sort of CIA, but it's kind of that's getting repurposed towards the SKIP program, the social care investment program, and then there was also some other bits and pieces that have been got rid of. But Chris says most of the estate is performing well. It was a bit bizarre because the level of voids across, whether it was an office or even sort of the industrial type stuff, did go down over the pandemic, which was a bit of a surprise. The only other set of assets that bring out as non-performing is we have got some historic stuff from the 80s where we're tied into long leases, and most of the money goes to the leaseholder as opposed to ourselves, and that's there's no real financial return on those, but it's something we're locked into, and we can't find a way out of it. Obviously the leaseholder doesn't see any benefit in selling when you've got to kind of somebody with covenant strengths that the county council has. So that's probably the only area, but we did offload a few non-performing ones a few years ago.
Thank you, Declan. Mr. Barclay.
Thank you, Chair. Just a comment, really. I think the way the finances have been managed last year, that they've actually turned out to be probably better than we would have anticipated. But I think the points that have been made is that we've received huge government funding regarding COVID, but there is still challenges to meet going forward in the next financial year. But really just to congratulate officers on a very achieved, really quite successful Outturn report, and the challenges of a hugely unpredictable year of where we were going have been managed very well. Quite worrying with regards to the school budgets and where we're going there. There seems to be a need for that to be looked at, not necessarily by Leicestershire County Council, but overall I think every council is suffering the same problems with funding schools and special educational needs, and the demand seems to be rising. So that's an area which isn't going to go away, as well as the challenges we face coming out of the pandemic, because all the problems are not going to disappear. But just congratulations to the officers for managing last year in the unprecedented times we did and coming out well.
Thank you, Mr. Barclay, and I think we'd all join you in thanking officers for all their work. Does Declan or Chris want to come back on that?
But just make a comment about it. I mean, Mr. Barclay's right. It was a very, very tough year last year. I mean, it's a tough year for everybody. And early on, before the government support was kind of announced, it was looking like we were going to be in a very sticky place financially. And in total, we've got about £100 million worth of extra grant for lots of different reasons, and that really has helped our financial position. If it wasn't for that, we would be in a very, very difficult position. There's no doubt about it.
And Mr. Bill.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I join with all the others in congratulating the officers, both the officers in this room and looking at us in the screen. You've all done a great job. Obviously, we've been bailed out this year, haven't we? Through the grants. It's been a very strange 16 months, whatever it is, 18 months, and it's very hard to compare what's happening with at the moment with what's happened in the past and what's going to happen in the future. But it still comes down to this basic problem that the county is underfunded. Now, could I ask, what is the latest situation with engaging with the new minister for levelling up, Mr. O'Brien? Obviously, I take it that senior officers and members are in touch with him over the situation. But could we have an update on just how these negotiations are are proceeding.
Thank you, Mr. Bill. Does Declan or Chris or Mr. Brecken wish to respond?
If I can, Chair, it's just, yeah, I mean, work is going on. Obviously, Neil is in the levelling up department within number 10. He has taken on board, along with Andrew Bridgen, who's the senior Leicestershire MP, a plan that was put together that basically, for a relatively short amount of money, would bring Leicestershire in line as not being the lowest funded county, but we'd be one of the lowest 28 funded counties, and it's across the board. It's across the board of political authorities as well, from a leadership point of view and control, and that work is looking it's looking positive. I think we know we need funding. We've obviously done a lot of work on that. Certainly, Chris and Declan are putting our input into that. And we just keep challenging and meeting. Certainly the leader and deputy leader have met, and certainly that work is ongoing. So I think that's the best we can offer at the moment. I mean, this was something that the previous person who sat in this position as lead member spent many years bringing to this forum and also to council and cabinet. But I think, yeah, we are hopeful that there is potential insight to actually get some monies back that will certainly help this council move forward. So that's the answer I'd give. I don't know whether Chris wants to add anything to that, or Declan.
If I could just add a couple of kind of things, I suppose, on the national context. The fair funding review kind of pre-pandemic, you know, was kind of going well, and it looked like it would actually be in place by now. But it does. The noises from government are that has gone on to ice, and it looks like that won't happen for at least a few years. So we are, as Lee says, we are looking at some kind of a short-term fix that might well help the lowest funded authorities like Leicestershire. But it looks like the actual kind of all singing, all dancing fair funding review is going to be delayed for at least a few years.
Okay, did you want to come back, Declan, or should we move on to the next question?
Yeah, happy to move on.
Okay, so I've got Mr. Hunt and Mr. Gillard, and is there anyone else who wants to make question, comment on the revenues before we move on to the next section? Okay, so over to Mr. Hunt.
Thank you very much. I mean, obviously there are a huge number of questions that we could talk about, and I'm grateful that we're just picking on the major ones. And mine is, it's actually paragraph 58, 59, the budget equalisation fund. Whether officers can say anything more about that, and whether indeed it's sustainable and will continue to serve purpose in the foreseeable future.
Mr. Hunt.
Declan, do you want to pick this one up?
Yeah, I can do, yeah. So we've created the budget equalisation reserve to just, we were putting the high needs block kind of, I suppose, the cash that we needed to reserve against the general fund, which is copied in truth what the external auditors expect us to do in the statement of accounts each year. But it was creating confusion because it looked like we had this sort of swelling general funds. We created into this budget equalisation reserve, which is kind of a bit of sort of an odd phrase, but it's one that a few councils do use. But in answer to the question, no, it's not sustainable. It's just a temporary pot of money that once it's spent, it's gone as it were. So until the high needs block problem is resolved, it's going to continue to create a drain onto other services. So it is very much a sort of a holding position until kind of there's resolution, and which in truth the scale of the problem is it can't just be solved locally. It needs to have kind of government intervention as well in terms of those reforms or additional funding.
Thank you, Declan, and then Mr. Gillard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to echo Councillor Barclay's comments earlier and wish to congratulate the staff on their outstanding efforts and work. Chairman, I just wanted to ask a question really. On page 32, 66, it states that County Council have claimed up to £3 million on the furlough scheme. Could somebody just tell me or give me an idea what the numbers are in relation to staff on furlough? Thank you.
Again, Declan, have you got the detail of that? I know we've still got a few staff on furlough, not that many compared to what we had at the peak, but I haven't got them to hand.
Just give me one sec. So we've got at the moment 87. In terms of headcount, it's 87 that are still on furlough. So the claim we're getting at the moment is about £40,000 a month. And the reason we've still got a handful on furlough is because the government changed the scheme. Probably it may even be getting on for I don't know, 6-9 months ago. So you don't have to be on furlough. Sort of, it's not a binary yes or no anymore. If your income levels are down, you can part-time furlough people. So we've still got a handful of services. Whether it's sort of be school food or Bow Manor, where things haven't bounced back fully yet. So we still have furlough about 87. I think at its peak, I don't have the numbers to hand for that, but it was probably in the sort of a couple of hundred or so that we did have at one point in time.
Thank you, and thank you to members for their questions on that section of the report. Declan, did you want to move on to the next part of the report? Thank you.
Yep, I can do, Chair. I won't go through this in much detail. In truth, a lot of the movement on earmarked funds are just a mirror of what's happening in either the revenue position or the capital position. This is kind of just where the sort of, I suppose, underspends end up, or kind of potentially an overspend end up. So it's kind of in terms of them, if you look overall, what's driven these sort of earmarked funds higher is because of the capital delays. Obviously, when you've got £40 million of slippage, that funding has to be held somewhere, and this is where it gets held. So I wasn't going to talk through any more detail than that, but happy to take any questions unless Chris or the lead member have any comments to make.
Any comments from Chris or Mr. Bracken before we open it up to members?
Nothing from myself.
Nothing for me either.
Any questions, comments from members on this section? Looks like no. So over to you, Declan.
Thank you, Chair. As a capital sort of, if I can just change the order of, go through things slightly. So if you go back to, if I just draw members' attention back to paragraph 14, and there's just a little kind of preamble about kind of capital in there, and the pressures we're under at the moment, and it's really key because of the size of the capital programme sort of grown to, consistently over the 4-year period, it's over £100 million. So it doesn't take much to create pressure. And that's what kind of paragraph 14 is just touching on. It's sort of just talking about the costs of schemes that are in early stages. So it's not so much for the ones that are up and running and kind of we've already got a price for the contract, but the ones that are getting sort of set up. And there's a range of drivers really, whether it's kind of the impact of COVID and how it sort of disrupted sort of global supply chains or changed sort of working practices. You've got things like commodity prices have gone up, but also kind of competing demand. High speed 2 gets kind of quoted, but sort of around the world, in truth, kind of there is demand on kind of sort of through sort of growth in infrastructure, demand on those sort of like the same resources, whether it's people or material. And the truth of the matter is we're unlikely to avoid these kind of these pressures, which tend to come down to sort of supply chain pressures, and it's just actually sort of it's going to be unavoidable, and it's coupled as well with sort of a growing level of infrastructure demand within the county to cope with either sort of the economic growth or the housing growth. So it's going to make, unfortunately, at some point over this sort of period, rationing of the capital programme is going to be essential, because we've kind of got growing demand, growing costs, and finite resources. So I just wanted to pull that one out and highlight it to members. I'll pick the capital section back up sort of down in paragraph 102, I think it is, where there's just a table there that summarises quite nicely what the overs and underspends in the programme are. And you'll see from that most of it is just pure slippage. Obviously, kind of we tend to suffer from a little bit of over optimism anyway in terms of our programme, and this was just sort of compounded by the fact that sort of COVID creates sort of closure of building sites, etc. early in the programme. So the key bits really are the overspend column, which are fairly small. 500,000 on children and 400,000 on the corporate resources programme. So the 500,000 on children was overspends on the some of the SEND kind of development work, but it can be, you'll see the underspend matches it off. They did some rejigging in the programme. They had some overs and unders, and we managed to contain that. In terms of the corporate resources one, that was on Sycenby Farm, and we were due to get Homes England's grant, but the terms of the grant meant actually it was more beneficial to turn that grant down, which is the overspend, and just actually sort of sell the farm ourselves. And you'll see that money coming through in the next few years as that farm is sold for housing. It's quite a few million pounds. In terms of the other variances, it's really a range of sort of slippage in a variety of reasons which tend to form around kind of permissions or kind of getting or agreement from sort of funding organisations. So I won't go through those in detail because it tends to be the same kind of picture. So if we go down to the one I was going to pick up was the CAFE table. So that's down on page 43. So members can just see what's happening there in the programme. That's sort of broken up amongst these asset classes. And you'll see that kind of ignoring the kind of the rural categories, which is the actually that was the Sisonby Farm thing that I just mentioned. It hasn't been sold yet, but it's had a capital appreciation. But if you ignore that one and the development category, the loss there, which is a reclassification from the a waste transfer station being built on an industrial site, you'll see that kind of actually the change in capital values is pretty sort of minimal. You know, it doesn't mean that's the end of the COVID disruption to capital values, but from sort of like almost a first brush through, it's shown the fund has been remarkably resilient, and actually it's been helped significantly by the fact that we're not involved in sort of either retail directly or retail warehousing. Whereas you'll see the pooled properties dropped a bit, and by its nature, is you know we bought into those products because they're diversified. They are sort of exposed across the sort of the market segment, so that had a bit of exposure there. But overall, if you strip out the development sort of category, the net income return at sort of 3.1% is very good. At hopefully the worst year we'll have for kind of the property sort of sector, but it compares very favourably to cash, which is obviously sort of bobbling around at sort of 0% returns, at, you know, a shade higher at the moment. So it's been a good kind of positive sort of set of income for the county council during sort of difficult times. And that's all I was going to touch on the capital programme. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Any questions, comments from members on capital programme? Mr. Richardson.
Just one of interest, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Paragraph 121 on page 41, where it talks about Snibston Country Park future strategy land remediation. It's an underspend, which is good. But it says that the work has been spent by the future user of the site or the end user. Who is the end user? I thought surely if it's a country park, we must be the end user.
It's a segment of it was earmarked to be sold for residential land, right. So just to the side of the park. So they'll do the land remediation.
It's not part of the country park, is what you mean?
Yeah. Apologies. The phrasing could have been better. Yeah, it just sits the other side of it. Yeah.
Hi, brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Declan. I've got Mrs. Page next.
Yes. Sorry about that. I've got to go back because I need to get my head around the business rates and the pool. And so if you can just give me an explanation, because I've been trying to think it over, but it doesn't. So Leicestershire has got a 40 million pot. Well, explain it to me, Chris, how it works, because it's just Leicestershire, not the city and Rutland. We're paying 40 million to the LEP. And so just, you know, how much do the districts retain? How much does the county retain? Just talk me through it, because it's important to get it right in my head, especially with the LEP coming up. And I refer to page 33, paragraph 69 to 72.
Okay, if I have a go at explaining, I'll let Declan kind of get the more detailed kind of figures because he's more on top of it than me. So we've got a business rate pool which operates across Leicester and Leicestershire, and we've had it for a number of years. It's been successful, and in total it's generated £40 million, and that £40 million would have gone back to the government now that comes into the pool. The way the pool works is the LEP are responsible for allocating that money. So there's a series of bids that will come in from ourselves, also come in from the city, and also come in from district councils. And those bids will kind of will be considered as a set of criteria, and they're considered, and the LEP allocate the money. What I'm not entirely certain about is how much money has been allocated and how much money is still kind of unallocated. I know we've had a fairly successful year just gone, and hopefully Declan has got the more detailed figures to hand.
So I don't have to hand what's allocated and what's not. They tend to run sort of a year or two behind, and we're generating about sort of £10 million a year at the moment. So if you want a sort of a rough stab, it's going to be sort of 20 to 30 has been allocated, and then kind of with the 10 almost waiting to get authority before it gets pulled in.
So how much? Okay. So there's a pool. It goes to the lab, but I still do not. How much do we, as the county council, get from the business rates? Do we get anything at all? Because it's not clear, and I might be a bit dim here.
The money that we get is to do this, the bids that we put in that are successful. So proportionately, again, I think we usually, but we're usually about 40%, aren't we, Declan? Is it rough?
Yeah, maybe a shade less, somewhere between 30-40% tends to be what we get, yeah.
But they're all allocated to specific kind of projects.
Thank you. Any more questions, comments from members? No. Okay. Anything else from Declan and Chris on this item?
No, nothing from me.
Okay.
If I can, Chair, just to sort of leave member, I think it has been difficult conditions last year, and I think it's pleasing on the capital that we actually managed to deliver so much. It is a lower than budgeted figure, but I think £105 million worth of expenditure is still significant. 1,000 new schools places across 18 sites have been done. We're continuing to invest in accommodation for adult social care service users. And we're also now commencing the investment programme for SEND children. £43 million invested in roads, improving, unlocking economic growth and easing congestion. And it was interesting, we sort of talked about Snibston Country Park, and it's interesting, I know this morning our Parks officer has been on BBC Radio Leicester talking to Ben Jackson about the opportunities and the programme that we're now doing as we start coming out of lockdown in a week's time. The programme that we've got there, and just trying to get people back into using the resources that, if you like, we haven't been able to make fully available to them in the last year and a half. So looking forward to that. But yeah, great work as well on the Corporate Asset Investment Fund. I know there are questions earlier from members, but that really is a good source of income. And I think whether it's capital appreciation or income net of costs, I think it's good that we've got that. It certainly gives us better returns than bank interest rates, which we all used to rely on in the olden days. But no, really good work, and yeah, happy to have had the report presented today. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Brecken, and thank you, Chris, Declan and Mr. Brecken, for your going through this report in detail, and to members for their questions and comments. So now we go on to item 10, which is the Corporate and Compliments Annual Report, and this is at pages 67 to 92 of your packs. I believe Chris is staying with us for this item, and we also have Gordon McFarlane, the Assistant Director of Corporate Resources, and Simon Parsons, the Customers Relations Manager, joining us online. So just to check, Gordon and Simon, if you can hear us okay and signals okay.
Can do, yep, can chat, thank you.
So Gordon, Simon, please go ahead and present the report. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just do a very quick introduction, and then Simon can come in on the detail. It's a report that's going to Cabinet later this month. You'll see from the paragraph 3 that corporate complaints is the main focus of the report, and it's an annual report that we do. We've got high numbers of corporate complaints and growing as well. Simon will come to some of that detail. We do touch on the adult social care and children's social care statutory complaint statistics towards the end of the report, but not in any detail. So it's corporate complaints that will be covered. So Simon is a complaints and information manager, and I'm going to hand straight to him to go through the detail of the report.
Thank you, Gordon. So, yeah, really just wanted to give a kind of an overview of the key themes and findings for last year's data, and talk through some of the factors that are behind the rise that Gordon mentioned. As I say, this area has been rising quite sharply, I guess, over the last 3 or 4 years. If I look back, it's really doubled in the last 5, but certainly, and again, this year saw a further 21% rise in the volume of corporate complaints, so up to 527 recorded last year. There's a mixture of reasons behind that. So some of that is clearly impact of COVID, with design changes in services that are seeing different things than we would normally see hit the complaints area. Some are just genuinely growth in demand around some of those services that are particularly squeezed at the moment, and I'll talk a little bit more about the particular ones there in due course. And some of it is actually more of is really down to some revised guidance issued approximately 18 months ago by the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, and really about how we consider and record complaints that previously were in the statutory children's social care area, and some fresh guidance that sees some of those more now recorded as corporate complaints. So some of that growth is in there, which has seen a reduction, commensurate reduction in the children's social care ones. That's significant in the sense that it helps reduce costs, because the statutory social care one has independent recourse to independent investigations, which we have to pay for. So it's not just a technicality thing. It does have an impact on costs to the organisation as well. So on the positive, it's worth saying up front, despite the rise in corporate complaints, on the positive, we've got less that translated into investigations by the Ombudsman last year. So we saw a 14% decrease in the number of decisions that they made, and also less that resulted in findings of maladministration. I'll caveat that slightly in that the Ombudsman did pause operations for a couple of months at the height of the pandemic, so that will be a factor as well, and some of those may yet translate into complaints in the next financial year. But on the face of it, that's positive to see better resolution at the local areas. Unfortunately, we did receive 2 public reports last year, and those have been the first for a number of years, really. As I say, that really, in some ways, we've done quite well to avoid those, I guess, in the last 5 or 6 years. It's been a very clear stated objective by the current Ombudsman to increase the number of public reports issued as part of their general way of highlighting key themes and raising awareness of topical issues. It's clear one of those public reports was firmly in that camp, which was to do with nursery provision and educational and basically the delivery of the free early years entitlement, the 30 years. That was the fault there was firmly centred on the provider rather than the council, but unfortunately the council has a duty around ensuring transparency of invoices and things. So ultimately have been caught by the Ombudsman's jurisdiction there. That decision, it's worth saying, is also a significant factor in the higher financial compensations awarded by the Ombudsman. But in the report, I've stated it as the worst case figure. Actually, it remains in negotiation with the provider, and I understand it's going quite well, and we'll be covering the lion's share of that. The other public report was around school admissions, which was much more our area, where there were just some gaps in terms of our monitoring of children outside of education, and has been responded to with a comprehensive action plan by the department. Touch on response times for complaints. That's absolutely crucial in terms of what the public expects. It's fair to say it was impacted slightly by the pandemic pressures. That's probably no surprise in some areas, particularly in some of the social care arms, but actually has remained fairly healthy throughout, with 77% of corporate complaints responded to within 20 working days, and 97% within the policy maximum, sort of the maximum 3 months as set out in the policy. So so in the context of the wider pressures and everything else going on, those remain fairly healthy and compare well with kind of regional counterparts in terms of the sort of anecdotal benchmarking that we do. Turning to the kind of areas that are really driving the growth then, and I'll just talk through. I've highlighted the sort of top 5 in terms of volume there through this year. So travel and transport, and really that was all about specific pressure points at the start of the academic year for special educational needs transport. It was undoubtedly exacerbated by COVID arrangements, late guidance around how we could deliver that function safely, which led to a pause in commissioning arrangements, but essentially all led to a number of placements not in place at the start of the year, and caused some significant pressures there. The challenge was around how we better manage that expectation, I guess, and some of that was around the communication was difficult. There was a focus, understandably, on getting the commissioning sort, but perhaps we kind of didn't quite manage the expectations as well as we could there, and that's probably the area to look at and make sure we learn from ahead of next year's process of recommissioning that, which is happening now really and through the summer. Waste management is the next area highlighted, and that's one of the ones that's very clearly saw an increase due to design arrangements, so principally around the implementation of the appointment-based booking system for inquiries, which clearly wasn't there before. A good half of those complaints were firmly around those processes. I think the important context there is it's huge numbers going through that process. So 580,000 transactions of waste appointments were booked through that year. Inevitably, some of those, for whatever reason, are going to suffer from some sort of technical issues around and fall out of that process into complaints. So I guess what I wanted to say, it's huge numbers going through there. So it's probably no surprise that we saw some around difficulties with progressing that process. If I strip out those numbers are very comparable in terms of the wider experience in waste sites, be those customer care issues, any accessibility issues around general waste management issues, and members will probably be aware that booking system's soon it won't be in place very shortly. So obviously those numbers should start to stabilise through there. Highways and footways, inevitably that always appears high up, just the nature of the services in the corporate complaints process. So it's always in the top 3 area. And again, I wouldn't highlight any specific issues there. What we tend to see, consistently in that area is much less around the high priority work that needs doing. So the clear and obvious damage to highways that present a safety risk are responded to very quickly and largely don't enter the complaints territory. Where we do see those complaints are around increasingly the ones that are identified as in need of work but not assessed as urgent. So they tend to go on waiting lists to be patched and packaged as part of wider work, but not necessarily an area that we've immediately got funding to do work and those sort of issues. So I guess the key thing there is about how we manage those expectations as those budgets start to get tighter to access that money for that kind of longer term work is the challenge there. Not an easy one to resolve, but it's certainly the area that we see hitting those complaint into the complaints territory. Special educational needs is interesting because this is one of those scenarios where an annual report by its nature backward looking always starts to feel a little bit old news, in the sense of it's presented in the report as an improvement on the previous year, and it was over that last year. We did start to see some clear improvements in terms of responses in reductions of complaints. Unfortunately, that position's starting to deteriorate a little bit again. So it's an area definitely that we need to keep a close eye on. again, huge growth in demand in that area. The number of children with educational healthcare plans is significantly up from several years ago, and that's really driving a lot of that, a lot of those complaints. Typically, the main areas are less about the placements themselves, and that's really because if it's solely about decisions around a placement named, a school placement named, then that would typically go through tribunal routes rather than complaints territories. It's much more about those processes around timely communication, the discipline of conducting annual reviews in a timely basis, issuing of reports in timescales, that kind of area. So lots of work going on departmentally in that area around restructuring it, around improving those processes, but inevitably some of that is going to take some time to come through and reduce those volumes. I think it's fair to say. I think the other things I'd touch on, it's important, as I always say in the annual report, to recognise where work is going well, and we've reported a further 255 compliments, again about a range of services, slightly down on the previous year. If I'm honest, I think the pandemic will be a factor there in terms of the priorities of departments. Understandably, will be perhaps on other things than the discipline of reporting in compliments. We've issued fresh reminders about that because it is important to capture all of those. But as I say, I'm sure that was a factor behind some of that thinking. I'll briefly touch on some of the other areas. As Gordon mentioned, this report won't major on the respective social care arms, but I think it's important to just give overall context around the direction of travel. So for adult social care, that actually saw a decrease in complaints last year of 11%, and also a decrease in volume of fault found and indeed ombudsman decisions. So all the numbers moving in the right direction on that one. And that does tend to buck the national trend a little bit, which is positive. There is some caveat in there, in the sense of I fully expect that there will be some complaints hitting us later than would ordinarily be the case, and I say that because of a couple of things. One, that we know that we paused some financial assessments during the pandemic, and that will result in some charges being retrospectively applied that inevitably families won't be expecting. It really depends on how well we've managed the communications and the correspondence around expectation management of that. But inevitably there will be some complaints to follow around that, I'm sure. And some of the others is the simple practicalities of, for a long period of time, families had no access into care homes, so in theory wouldn't have been able to. Would have some complaints that would have generated from those routine visits obviously wouldn't have reached us because there wouldn't have been any awareness, and some of that may yet emerge. So one to keep an eye on, but on the face of it, positive numbers in that area. Children's social care, similar picture, a big reduction in numbers. I mentioned the reason. That's less about volume decrease per se. It's more about sums gone into the corporate complaints territory rather than the social care. It's fairly stable if I look at it in the round, and again fairly stable escalation rates going through the stages into stage 2 independent investigation. So 11% of the overall volume hitting there. That's fairly stable, and again fairly stable numbers in terms of ombudsman decision making, with just 2 adverse decisions through the year on there. I guess the final comment I just kind of wanted to really recognise through the report and just explain a little bit about work that we're doing on there is really on page 76 of your papers. That the graphic I've included kind of shows the, again, significant increase in sort of volume of inquiries, I'll call them, that don't require formal investigation through the complaints process, but would obviously hit our team as needing something. And that's typically where people are struggling to access services. It may be simply they're struggling to get through to a number. It could be that they can't do a process they're trying to do online, and we're well positioned to obviously work through those in terms of fixing and solving them. So if we resolve them within the 24 hours, they're recorded as that, and that area, along with along with all the other things that are for other authorities or for different processes, is an area that it keeps increasing in volume year on year. Some of that's just about better discipline in recording that. But we're doing some work right now with colleagues in our customer service area around, have we got the right process around there? Are there any other opportunities for different channels to resolve those? Do we need to make any tweaks on our online platform to kind of to route those into the services first time? So just some work to make members aware is going on in that area as well. I think that's probably the key messages, and that from me, unless Gordon wants to add anything there before pause to take any questions around any of that.
No, nothing more from me, Simon. I think that's really thorough.
Thank you, Simon, for a very detailed report there. And in terms of comments and questions, I've got Mr. Morgan, followed by Mr. Pendleton and Mr. Poland, and Mr. Richardson. So, Mr. Morgan.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you very much, Steve, for and Gordon for a very, very thorough explanation of the report, which in turn was also very, very thorough. So this is probably a very, very sort of brief question, I suspect. In relation to the local government ombudsman, so my understanding is obviously you confirmed that there was a pause in their work over the past year. I've been told quite recently by a couple of local MPs in Leicestershire that actually they have now, I think it's fair to say, probably decided to restrict future workflow even from MPs, particularly in sort of referrals. My concern on that is that at the moment it's obviously the sort of last resort as far as many people have, if they feel that their complaints are not being dealt with by us as a local authority. If they are now restricting their workflow, how do we now satisfy our residents that even if they exhaust our extensive complaints procedures, that there are other ways of seeking further explanation? I mean, obviously, there are MPs they can turn to. However, if those MPs themselves can't actually get redress through local ombudsman, then we are going to be dealing with frustrated residents who feel that somehow they're not being listened to. Our complaints procedures are clearly pretty extensive, and it's pretty exceptional that actually somebody needs to actually go further. But again, I mean, not only probably the mitigation of how do we actually deal and answer queries from those residents, but also the comparison of data, because actually if there is a restriction being applied to referrals, then obviously our year by year comparisons will also no longer be relevant, and we need to reflect that with the way that we report the information that we're reporting. So very, very briefly, you're probably aware of that as well, and it's what are we doing if we're able to do anything at all?
Okay, so I'll probably know a little bit more around from the local government and social care's ombudsman's position in a couple of weeks. They're due to release their annual review report on local government complaints on the 21st of July. That's due to come out along with local authority letters, and they're actually running a webinar for the first time this year around accompanying that as that report's released. So I'll know a little bit more, hopefully, from the position from the ombudsman there. In terms of news that's reached me as the link officer, they've not publicly stated that they have changed their process in terms of restricting workflow. What they have said is that they are looking to do much more at what they call the assessment team. It's kind of a lower level investigation triage function where they will do a less in-depth analysis of the complaint, but focused very much on, are they likely to find fault? So not a full depth investigation, but they'll look at it on the subject matter. Are they likely to find anything here? Can they even do anything about it, even if they were? And there are some jurisdictional issues that the ombudsman has that would prevent them getting involved in certain things. So I think there will be more being looked at that kind of assessment triage level moving forwards than the full investigation. But I guess what that is still doing is still giving residents that assurance that it had an independent oversight, and they very much have that discretion around if they see anything amiss or if they're worried about that. And what they also use is that wider intelligence around themes around local authorities. So, you know, they will have an idea of, is this a regular kind of thematic complaint that they're seeing around any particular council or area that may of course be in their thinking around whether to investigate or not. So I think in terms of other assurance we can give residents, members may recall 2 years ago we changed our processes in corporate complaints to add a step in there, and that was very much to add another stage. There were a review stage in it. It used to be single stage process. We added a second review stage in, very much to ensure that no complaint is either signposted or exhausted before it goes to the Ombudsman without as a minimum head of service oversight on that complaint in terms of signing that off. So just around that belt and braces reassurance, all complaints before we finish them have had that very much had that senior management oversight on them. That's probably the main reassurance I can give on that, I think.
Thank you, Simon. Mr. Pendleton.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank Gordon and Simon for a very comprehensive report and, frankly, an honest report. Equally, we've got to congratulate our staff, you know, over the last year for the absolute dexterity with which they've attempted, most of them working from home, to actually still deliver our statutory services. I mean, travel and transport, for instance, hit, and I know this as I was then the lead member for that particular area, hit a brick wall almost because of external late decisions, and we had at that point to second extra staff in, and this is what, you know, I think we need to pay credit to our staff for doing. We had to get them in to actually try and hit the deadlines. We missed the deadlines with a few, dead straight, honest, but my gosh, the staff didn't half shift a throughput, which I've never seen them do, and we've never done historically in that way before. Again, waste management. Yeah, we had to design a new system, and that's led to complaints. It took me, I know I'm a Silver Surfer, but it took me half an hour to actually get an appointment, you know, and I'd instigated the system myself, but it was to protect our staff and our public that we actually had that system in. That raised more complaints, I think, than maybe historically, Chairman, we've had, but that was it. Equally, I do know that highways suffer because of underfunding, but this administration has found a goodly number of millions now to put into highways in terms of new funds for each member as well, to at least start to address the problem. It's not going to blow it away, but if every member takes one problem in their patch and deals with it, that will at least be 50 odd less problems to deal with. And I think that's really great. I'm happy also to say, I think that, am I right? Please, gentlemen, could you tell me? Grass cutting complaints are the lowest in the last 3 years. This has to be something to do with our greening of Leicestershire, I believe, but I'll leave you with that. Those are the comments that I think, and the context with which I think we should also view this very honest report, and congratulate our staff for dealing with them. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Pendleton. I think the whole Commission would join in congratulating staff for all the work that they've done over the years. So thank you for those comments. And over to Simon and Gordon, if you wish to respond.
I just wonder if I could just respond really briefly. I think this is where benchmarking is really important. So if we recognise we've had, to say the least, an exceptional year, and that has meant some differences in the types, the nature and numbers of complaints that we've had, I think this is where benchmarking comes in. It's really important, but also looking at the future. And I think that draws on the previous question around, you know, if we do have changes in the way the Ombudsman looks at things, ultimately, those are small numbers compared to a total numbers of complaints. But what does that do as well? So taking it all in the round, as well as those improvements in service that Mr. Pendleton was talking about, it just feels important that we keep on reviewing, monitoring, and reporting to you as a scrutiny commission as well. I don't know if you want to add anything, Simon.
No, I just make a quick comment on the specific grass cutting point that was mentioned. It is correct that that's the lowest, certainly for a good 5 years, the lowest that I've reported on that area. There'll be a combination of things. I think you're right. I think the green agenda will be a factor in that. I think also the other bit I'd highlight is it's a lot easier for residents now to easily view when their areas are due for cuts and things like that. So lots of the ones we used to get were just around inability to find out when things were getting cut. You can now very easily search that online. It can answer a lot of your questions. You can report it online through there. So I think, if I'm honest, a lot that we used to come to us through that route will either resolve things for themselves online, or will then send it through into the usual kind of customer service channel through that route. So either way, a significant service improvement.
Thank you, Gordon, Simon, and Mr. Poland.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the reports. I know when I've looked at complaints reports in the past, you can sort of look at them in two ways. You can either say, on the one hand, it's a shame that people had to complain, but on the other hand, you can look at it as an opportunity to, as a learning experience and to take on board and therefore grow as an organisation. So complaining per se isn't necessarily a bad thing. The questions, comments really I've got, I mean, obviously, in addition to being a county councillor, I'm a borough councillor. My day job's actually working for an MP. So dealing with the public, something I do on a everyday, many times a day basis. And through all three roles, we have what's known as frequent flyers, people whose apparent hobby is writing complaints and writing in. So the questions I had of the 527, do we know how many, are they 527 different people, or if we were to look at it, would it be a lot of the same names appearing? And do we factor that in at all? So that was sort of my first question and thought. And the second one really, and again, this is more of a thought than a question, is the compliments. We've got 255 this year, 412 last year. People in my experience, generally speaking, don't write in and tell me as a councillor when they're happy with something. I can count the number of times on one hand you get an email going, thank you very much for that, really appreciate it. That's the nature of the job, people writing when they're unhappy. And I imagine the same is exactly true with a complaint and a compliment. So the thought I had, if we've got 255 people motivated and happy enough to write in and say, that was great, thank you very much, how many thousands more across the county are actually still happy, they just haven't written in to tell us? And that really, I think, is something we have to bear in mind here, that there will be thousands of people across this county who are at the very least satisfied and very probably happy with the service they are receiving. And again, I think that needs to be put into this context as well.
Thank you, Mr. Poland. Gordon, Simon, did you want to come back on those comments?
Happy to come back on around the sort of the repeat complaints theme on there. So you're absolutely right. We will, like others, we will see a number of residents that that we will probably never be able to fully resolve their concerns. Either it's just not going to be achievable within the scope of service delivery and things. In terms of the proportion, I wouldn't like to give an exact kind of number on that. What I'd say is that there will be some cases where individuals are representing will have more than one complaint in that 527. What I'd say is where it's pretty much the same theme, it's returning people on the same complaint, often we will link those together rather than creating new ones. So it will be seen as that as ultimately this is about the same issue that we've already responded to. We might do a further response. We might repeat that they have a route of escalation to the ombudsman, etc. And that would be captured under a kind of single complaint. So it's all one file effectively and in one number. Obviously, if it's entirely separate issues, then yeah, generated as a new complaint and things. So yes, it's a factor. It would, it will be. It's not huge numbers in terms of that 527. It would probably be in the order of maybe 5 to 10% probably would be returning ones in there. That kind of territory. And really on the compliments front, I absolutely agree. We're always conscious that what we formally record there is probably the tip of the iceberg in terms of the ones that are out there. There will also be ones that have been motivated over and above the 255 to send in compliments, but have directed departments and haven't made their way to us. So we absolutely know that's an underrepresentation of the figure. We've done well in improving that over the years in terms of just improving the visibility of those, should we say? But I agree with your comments. It's particularly in the last year. It's still very it's very good to know that that number of people still found the time with everything else going on to recognise the good work that's being delivered out there by departments.
I think just to add to that, if I can, around the compliments, it's probably just worth noting that the council runs or commissions a regular survey of sections of the public across Leicestershire. So we do get, I think it's quarterly, I can't quite remember, I couldn't find it in time, but that gives us a measure of levels of satisfaction with county council services and how the county council is generally operating. So most compliments are a really important measure. We've clearly got some wider measures as well that we can benchmark and report on too.
Thank you. And Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. Like Councillor Poland, I wish my email box had more compliments in it than complaints. But I'm fortunate, or not as the case may be, to have a waste disposal site in my division. And my biggest post bag has been the waste disposal site in my division. Most of which I've answered, and clearly therefore there's a large level of complaints, I suspect, going to councillors which never reach the county council. But my question is a bit more general, is that the biggest complaint about not being able to use a waste disposal site generally is fly tipping, which has gone up astronomically. So what correlation have we done as a council looking at instances of fly tipping coming back to whether or not we can associate an increase in that? Now, I appreciate that, one might argue that people fly tip anyway, but what I'm saying is a large increase in fly tipping, it's the increase bit that could be construed almost as a complaint about it. So I just wondered, do we do any work on correlating physical events back to the actual one? And we know these people shouldn't be doing it. We know we try everything to stop them, and there's no excuse for it, but I just wonder if we look at those figures.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Before I bring in the officers, I think Mr. Pendleton has a comment to add.
Thank you, Chair. And again, as the last lead member for Environment, Transport and Highways, I did the correlation exercise. Joanna Guile did it as the officer concerned, and there was actually no straight correlation between the lack of ability to use our residual household waste facility and fly tipping. They're two different things. Thank you, Chairman. Just thought I'd put that in for what it's worth.
Thank you, Mr. Pendleton. Mr. Simon Gordon, did you want to add anything to that?
Don't think
not from me. No, I can't add anything more. No.
Any other members have any more questions on this report? I can't see any hands. So thank you very much to Gordon and Simon for coming today and answering all the questions and providing a large amount of information, and to all members for their comments and questions. So we therefore move on to item 11, which is the report to be considered by the Cabinet later this month on the Leicester and Leicestershire Economic Growth Strategy. and this is in your pack at pages 93 to 144. We've got Simon Lawrence, who's head of the growth unit, to introduce the item, and we have Tom Purnell, Assistant Chief Executive, also joining us online. We've also Mr. Bedford, the lead member for COVID Recovery and Ways of Working, who represents the County Council on the LEP board, joining us online. Welcome, Mr. Bedford. And just to check that Mr. Bedford and Tom can both hear us okay?
Yes, I can, Chair.
Yes, I can, Chair, as well.
Great. Okay. Well, Simon, if you can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The purpose of this report is to present to the Scrutiny Commission the draft economic growth strategy for Leicester and Leicestershire, which is being led by the LEP and is currently subject to a stakeholder consultation exercise. Work on the strategy for Leicester and Leicestershire started earlier in the year in response to the significant impact of the pandemic on businesses and individuals in the city and the county. The need for the strategy, I'd suggest, is clear, and it reflects the fact that there is no single strategy for the sub-region in place currently that sets out sector priorities or a vision for the economy. This strategy will resolve that. LEP board members have attended a series of workshops during which the structure, focus and content of the draft strategy have been discussed, and a first draft was shared amongst board members in early June. The County Council has been represented at these workshops by the Leader of the Council and Mr. Bedford. The Cabinet received a report at its meeting on the 22nd of June. This report sought the Cabinet's view on a series of observations on the pre-consultation version of the strategy and recommended that these be reflected in the version in front of you today. Paragraph 32 of the report presented to the Commission and going to Cabinet in July sets out a series of observations again on this draft strategy. Many of those recommendations that were included in the June Cabinet report have been included, but some haven't. So whilst the observations complement many elements of the draft strategy, it also suggests that the document needs to be clearer in the role of the partners in delivering the vision, more accurately reflective of the specific opportunities and challenges in Leicester and Leicestershire, and particularly rural issues, clear in terms of inward investment opportunities, clear about the role of town centres in supporting economic growth, and also that it needs to be more explicit in its response to the County Council's climate emergency declaration. So the Scrutiny Commission's view on the draft strategy can be reported to Cabinet on the 20th of July and then on to the LEP in due course. And finally, Chair, the stakeholder consultation closes on the 30th of July. The LEP board is due to meet on the 19th of August to consider the views expressed in the consultation with a view to formal publication of the strategy at the end of August, ahead of a further full public consultation exercise on the document. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Simon. Tom, did you have anything further to add to the report?
No, nothing to add from me, Chair.
Mr. Bedford, before we ask members for questions, did you want to add anything?
Just to really outline my own involvement in this process. So I joined the LEP board in June, taking over from the Leader of the Council. So I attended one of the workshops and I fed in some of the initial feedback from conversations with myself and Simon. I guess some points I'd like to pull out really about what we need to be clearer on in the strategy is things like the impact of COVID on Leicester and Leicestershire, the impact on the rural economy and how the strategy will address that. Also, further clarity on the green agenda, obviously that the County Council has expressed, it's concerned about the environment and the climate emergency. And there's also no mention of HS2. So there are some key points that I'd like to see pulled out in this document. And some of those comments have already been made at a previous Cabinet meeting. And I'm sure members of the Scrutiny Commission will have their own views on the need for the strategy to more clearly articulate those points. So that's all I really wanted to add at the start, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bedford. So over to members. Mr. Hunt.
I found this a bit of a shocker, actually. I was looking forward to reading the strategy from the LEP, which is absolutely vital for the development of the economy in the county and indeed the city and region. And when I read through the comments made in paragraph 32, which Mr. Bedford's just briefly outlined as well. I thought they were all spot on, but far too polite. That a strategy like this has got to be clear, and almost every criticism that the Cabinet's made, quite rightly, is that it has not enough clarity within it. I think there's far too much repetition of what the LEP has done, particularly with regard to the sort of crown jewels that they seem to be repeating, which is, Myra, Lucep, Segro, this gateway, that gateway, and something called the Loughborough area of innovation, which is now somewhat dated, but not really much about where they propose to put resources which they manage, and the resources that they manage are absolutely pivotal to their role. That's what they do. So that was my initial response. When I read through it in detail, COVID is something that we're all dealing with and affects every part of our lives, and I felt to say that was something that the strategy could deal with was a little bit exaggerated. But whereas the key changes that are going to happen, and the strategy doesn't really address changes that are going to happen or changes that are needed in the strategy, which is obviously Brexit, which hardly given a mention, although there is reference to trade. But how the economy and how the city and county respond to Brexit is absolutely important. Whichever view you take about Brexit, it is clearly a fundamental change in what will happen to our economy in the next 10 years. And the other one was the Freeport. Now, Freeport actually is independent of Brexit. It could have happened anyway, and indeed it was happening to a very large extent with the development by the airport. But it's not clear of the 60,000 new, apparently high quality jobs that are going to be created by the Freeport, where they're going to come from, where the training is, and whether it's going to affect Leicestershire more than, for example, Derbyshire or Nottinghamshire. So the opportunities, if they are, from those two endeavours, the Brexit and Freeport, are completely lost in the rest of the report, strategy. And just finally on HS2, HS2 obviously important, but on transport generally, I think they've kind of left that to Midlands Engine, which has a strategy which is, in view of the external factors, is looking increasingly out of date. And I just might mention, because I know that Tom will be interested in this and know about the prosperity report that was produced on the county and city, which was quite critical of the dependence we have put on transport and GVA, I think. Anyway, that's perhaps a detail. But honestly, I thought that the Cabinet's comments were spot on, a bit too polite, and it really needs to go back for a fundamental review. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hunt. Who would like to respond to Mr. Hunt's comments? Simon?
And Tom and Mr. Bedford might want to come in as well. I take on board Mr. Hunt's remarks, and I guess it's for the Commission to make those points clear to the Cabinet next week.
If I could just add, it's Tom Purnell here. I think we can perhaps taken on board Mr. Hunt's comments, say a little bit more about the Freeport in responding to the LEP, although the LEP's role in the Freeport isn't as strong as it might be, with the local authorities and the landowners being the prime movers and members of the board. But that's something we can certainly provide a bit more detail on.
Thank you, Chair. But shall I come in as well? I think Mr. Hunt's comments are spot on. I mean, in terms of the observations that I've made and that Simon's already articulated, I think that it's important this strategy doesn't just land on some civil servant's desk and sit there and not really be read or taken on board. So it's really important that we get this right. As I say, the cabinet has already made some remarks at the last meeting, and I'm sure that we can look at making our points more forcefully when this is reported back to the LEP. There is a LEP board meeting in August, so obviously I'll be attending that on behalf of the County Council and articulating those points that Mr. Hunt and the report outlines. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Mr. Bill, Mrs. Page, Mr. Morgan and Mr. Pendleton. So, Mr. Bill.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I agree with what's been said so far. I wonder whether I could widen the discussion slightly. I've been expressing my concern about overdevelopment, both in this virtually and in relationship to the strategic growth plan and the members advisory group which I attend, because we have this report in front of us now. We've also seen a report which was commissioned by Harborough District Council, which outlines the demand for warehousing and logistics assets. What we know what's happening on the ground, I think, and I hope people can contradict me if I'm wrong, but what seems to be happening on the ground is we're now having a mismatch between job vacancies and people available for work, even taking into account the end of furloughing. I looked up yesterday the number of jobs that are available within 10 miles of Hinckley, and it came to 3,665. So that's 3,665 vacancies available today. We know that in the pipeline, we've potentially got the Hinckley Freight Depot, where we were told 2 days ago it is still aiming to provide 8,000 jobs. So that brings us up to 11,000. Magna Park, I believe, is due to double, or at least that's their ambition. The Whetstone Pastures industrial area is going to expand as well. Max tells us this morning that there's going to be 60,000 jobs provided at the Freeport. So the question then arises is where are the people coming from who are going to take up all this work? I mean, it's great that there is all this work. I mean, it was only 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when we were in depression and recession and all the rest of it, we were longing for work. But now we've got everything coming into this area because of the Golden Triangle, because of the and all that entails. We now have an excessive number of vacancies and nobody to fill them. I understand, for example, that at Magna Park, it's not Lutterworth people who are coming into Magna Park in any numbers, it's people coming in from Burton-on-Trent. Now, if we're going to have yet another Magna Park and another freight depot, and according to the Harborough report, yet another freight depot on top of that, we've got a total imbalance of jobs and people. And presumably the pressure will then come about from at government level to say, well, if you've got all this work, you've got to expand the number of towns and villages. Now, all I'm asking this morning is anybody thinking this thing through? We know that we're going to have, what is it, 5 garden villages or something of that nature. But with all this work, which really is welcome and it's coming our way, are we going to be looking at 5 more garden villages on top of that? I mean, all I'm asking this morning is anybody here or anywhere else thinking this through so that we know what the future of this county is going to look like if and when all this comes to fruition?
Thank you, Mr. Bill. Simon, did you want to start with responding?
Thank you, Chair. Just to make one observation, I guess we're here to talk about the economic growth strategy document and not the broader debate. But the point has been made in paragraph 32 that this strategy needs to pay closer attention to the work of the strategic growth plan and make the connections across both from the economic growth approach and the wider growth strategy. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Simon. Did either Tom or Mr. Bedford want to respond to Mr. Bill's comments?
Just to reiterate what Simon said. I mean, this is a specific economic strategy that the Leicester is developing here, and the points Mr. Bill makes about development absolutely is a concern of everyone's, but that isn't the focus of this particular paper. It's about the longer term strategy for the economic benefit of Leicestershire. So, I mean, the points he makes around development are important and absolutely are considered in the round. So I really don't have much more to add than if Tom wants to come in.
The only thing I would add, I think, is Mr. Bill's comments, I think, emphasise the importance of skills and training to make sure that where there are vacancies, that we do have the measures in place to support local people who aren't in work to access those.
Thank you. And Mrs. Page.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Bills. I can always rely on you. Just as an add-on, before I come to my comments, I fully agree. I think it needs to be addressed. We are having a lot of skill shortages. We have a lot of job vacancies. I can only talk from my area, and I think it is well known that there is a shortage of lorry drivers. So, and I never understand why business, or rather the LEP, MPs, etc., do not focus on training or doing more to encourage people, because around me the industry is built up on logistics. So if you have logistics, you need lorry drivers. And I think there needs to be a far greater emphasis on that, because there will be, in the long term, a very negative effect without that being addressed. But to my point, I find that the strategy is very high level. And personally, I would have liked to have seen more tangible outcomes, or at least, as we said previously, maybe some indicators, some KA that reflects on previous and on achievements. And that would be something I'd probably like to see. I fully agree on the comments on page 98. Going downwards, and we have repeatedly said that the strategy talks about being inclusive, yet it isn't fully inclusive of rural areas. Therefore, I welcome point E, F and G, but I think what needs to be added there, it is, as Councillor Bedford said, the impact on businesses in rural areas. We do have a great deal of businesses, of small SMG people who are working from home, and the impact is not recognised. I think what the strategy would need, and I would love to see, it's a roadmap to recovery set out. I love flowcharts, but also an indication how we are going to look at the economy after COVID. Because there will be an after COVID, and we need to recognise and work the recovery into the future of businesses in Leicester and Leicestershire. I've got 2 more points. Hang on, I think it's page 97, and I'm going to waffle some more. On page 97, I think they're the pillars. Yep, they're the pillars are under point 28. And we're talking about inclusive and sustainable places, city and town centres. Should we not also add rural market towns in that? Because they are very important too. And in inclusive, we're talking young people have informed choices and routes to jobs and pay progression. And here comes my bugbear. If we are all inclusive, and we are wanting to include young people from rural areas and indeed workers, because what we've got now, and I know that for a fact, everybody from the city, from Hinckley, from Coventry, from Wales, they work in Magna Park. But I have got an awful lot of young people who want to work in the city. I've got students, I've got people who want to work in retail and in offices. Yet I can name you a lot of young people who had to give up their jobs in the city because they were paid a minimum wage or a very low wage, such as retail and such as maybe an office junior or working in a solicitor's. On top of these young people getting a low wage, having to travel in and paying their petrol costs, they are hit with a very high parking fee. That takes away a considerable amount of their daily wage. And I think that is not acceptable to be inclusive. Now then, on top of this, we are talking about the city who are just launched their consultation on their transport strategy. And whilst car parking charges is wonderful income for the city, but how does it disadvantage not only the businesses, but the people from my area who want to train as a solicitor, who want to be a part of an accountant's area, or indeed probably work at Debenhams. So therefore, my question is, how does the LEP respond to the city's transport strategy? Because obviously, to me, it does not fit in the realm what the LEP is setting out. It disadvantaged inclusivity, well, you know, us from rural areas. It's difficult already to go into the city. There isn't a bus network. And inclusive means that people from rural areas can also work in the city. And my last point is a very, very short one. Could we have the link circulated again? So maybe for us to circulate again that people from our parish councils can feed into the strategy, whether they do or not, but I'd like to give them that opportunity. So instead of me moaning at you that we are not inclusive to people from rural areas, that they can respond. And if the officers can please respond to me on the inclusivity and how they respond to the transport strategy and how they think it will match up with a strategy, I would be very grateful. Oh, and that reminds me, I have got one more point, and that is in relation, and I forgot now, sorry.
Thank you, Mrs. Page. Simon, did you want to start by responding to the comments?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mrs. Page. I guess from your clear description, it's around the breadth of the inclusive priority that has been considered in this draft strategy. So I'd be happy to pass back or through the Cabinet additional comments in relation to your view on the strategy and seeking specifically the point that you're making around the link to the city's transport priorities. I can't answer that here, of course, but it's a point well made in terms of the relevance and significance of this particular strategy.
If I may come back, because if you have a strategy that talks about inclusivity and talks about the rural areas, it's got to also have an enabler to get the people from the rural area and the young people which we're trying to train, because we can't just focus, whilst I did say, yes, we need to focus on training lorry drivers, but there are people who want to work in solicitors' offices, in banking, but we haven't got that in rural areas. So we have got to dovetail that to make it happen. And that cannot be made happen if we are charging them. There are no bus services, or that, you know, they're inhibited in any other way. Thank you.
Tom and Mr. Bedford, did you want to respond to Mrs. Page's comments?
Nothing to add from me, Chair.
Just to say that, you know, Mrs. Rosita's comments, you know, I agree with many of her comments there, particularly around the need for skills and upskilling, and that's a real focus. But I'm happy to obviously articulate those points that she's made at Cabinet when this comes to Cabinet before the end of the consultation.
Thank you. I have Mr. Pendleton and Mr. Morgan and Mrs. Fryer.
Thank you, Chairman. Of course, planning is the district considerations, certainly as far as housing is concerned, and I'm well aware of Mr. Bill's concern about overdevelopment on housing. But I have to say he's answered his own question, and from a county point of view and the strategic plan point of view, we really do have to look, you know, at the fact that Freeports will generate, my Freeport will generate 6,000 jobs, not 60, 6,000 jobs. The rail freight to you will generate 8,000 jobs. Junction 2 rail freight, sorry, Junction 24 rail freight, 6,000 jobs, and it's developing at the moment. And then you look at HS2, which the report has already said is not fully taken into account yet because it can't. But the fact that that will come from government at some point. So it's a bit hard to sort of hammer the report too much. And then the independent rail plan, Chairman, which is also imminent in a national sense, will also really impact upon our development here in the county. So it is a difficult one, but you know, we will have to deal with it. Yes, it's being dealt with at the forum which you mentioned, and we have two district council leaders here in Scrutiny who are well aware of that and will deal with that. And it's a matter of matching housing to where the development is, and that is what is going on. So have no worries, Councillor Bill. That has to be the way that we will go to keep journey times short and all the rest of it. On the Leicester City transport strategy and the workplace levy, can I say, as somebody that lives and represents Castle Donington and Kegworth, in all seriousness, it will affect you, because the Nottinghamshire workplace levy affects us, and we are 9 miles away from the city of Nottingham, and we get people driving in 3 and 4 cars and piling into one car, leaving them in the village and villagers and disappearing. It will affect, and this is really vitally important for us to bear in mind. And that the city mayor looking at a golden fleece or a pot or whatever he's got, we really do need to make sure that we tell him what the consequences for all the areas around the city will be. And I think that if it needs to be even more specific, I think we might well need to include quite a lot on the city's workplace parking levy and how that will affect us as well in this report. Thank you, Chairman. Sorry, I've gone on a bit.
Thank you, Mr. Pendleton. Did you want to respond to any of Mr. Pendleton's assignment, or Tom or Mr. Bedford, did you want to respond to anything Mr. Pendleton said? No. Okay. So, Mr. Morgan.
Thank you very much, Chairman. As ever, Mr. Pendleton talks much sense, and it's always nice to follow him because I can noddle away and add to a few of the comments that he was saying. I think my general comments would be about this as a strategy, and I think what's been interesting is actually several of the points that have been raised today actually have very little to do with this as a strategy that we're looking at before us. There are common themes, and clearly they, as Mr. Pendleton has outlined, are themes that are not new, but they are not necessarily directly applied to this document as a strategy. And indeed, looking through some of the comments under item 32 in particular, it's clear that there are comments that have been made already, which apply a bit like the point about development. HS2, Mr. Pendleton said it's, as we know, it's still being talked about. It hasn't been resolved, and as a result, actually having a definitive point within a strategy to it, when you don't actually sort of nailing a blancmange to a wall, it's very difficult to do. And as a result, you can run into generalizations because, to be frank, unless you actually know specifically what you're addressing, generalizations are probably the best that you can do. And there are other points as well. I mean, for instance, there's reference, I think the Cabinet has already made reference to under point 32, for instance, the devolution white paper. Well, the devolution white paper has been put back already a year and a half. Actually, none of us genuinely know what's going to be in the devolution white paper. We can speculate to the specifics, but as a result, having a strategy applying, making reference specifically to a document that is still being developed and worked on, and I understand from those involved has moved on a great deal over the last few months. It's very difficult for a strategy by default, which is a general document. It's a sort of a high-level document that is not necessarily about the detail. Is very difficult to actually relate to. Likewise, some of the other points that have been referred to that are not necessarily under the control of the LEP, and also, there are Mr. Bedford, Mr. Richards, and myself. We have already declared interests as fellow directors as well of the LEP, but. It is very interesting, having sat on the board of the LEP for the last couple of years. The one thing that really genuinely comes out is actually quite interesting from our perspective as county councillors, but also when you start throwing in some of the business leaders, not only involved in the city, but also Eastman's Airport and various other areas, the breadth and scale of the economic life of our county and our city area. And actually, at that point, what may be a crucial industry in one part of the county, maybe it's logistics, or in my part of Leicestershire in Loughborough, it's the university and the Charnwood campus and all of the amazing research and work that comes out of those areas. There isn't a university in the areas that are actually dominated by logistics, and likewise, there are no logistics in the area dominated by the university and research. And as a result, we sometimes can become quite focused on our geographical areas and what is important to us locally. And unfortunately, a strategy by default that's dealing with a very wide geographic area and a very broad economic area can be quite general. And if there are criticisms of this as a strategy, it is unfortunately that it actually reflects a very diverse economic area and geographically which has geographically very strong centres. So I think there are some valid criticisms of this as strategy, but we have to remember a strategy is a very high level document, and it tries to reflect what is an extraordinarily diverse and complex economic area. And certainly, whilst it would be great to be able to reflect some of those things like workplace parking, for instance, that have come up during the development of this strategy, if they come up during it, the risk is that you end up pushing down the line until you finally get to the point where you can say to everyone, stop introducing new ideas, stop putting forward new policies, because actually we're still trying to actually nail down the final draft of our strategy. Things will be left out. It will not be possible, I suspect, to accommodate every new proposal that's come forward. But hopefully, the comments today and the comments through Cabinet and those particularly that are then fed through from Mr. Bedford to the board itself will help to actually make any document that hopefully covers the area that we're talking about a stronger strategy, and something that's actually a little bit more reflective of the true nature of the county and the city and the economic life within it. All I'm saying is strategies are not perfect. I would never expect this strategy to be perfect, but hopefully it can be slightly more refined and reflective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Simon, did you want to come in on the comments, or Mr. Bedford? Mr. Tom, did you want to come back on anything Mr. Morgan said? No? Okay.
No, really helpful. Thank you.
Chairman, may I just come back on Mr. Morgan? While I fully appreciate his rhetoric, and I fully appreciate that this document is highly strategic, but at the end of the day, even a strategic document has got to be realistic, and it has got to reflect some of the points which people are concerned about. And I think a touch of reality goes a long way, and hopefully the directors who are sitting here should take that on board, because at the end of the day, we all represent also our communities. And that reminded me of the point which I forgot. It is priority 2, sustainable transport and connectivity. Within this and the LEP and whatever, going back to all our points, we have supported extreme logistic parks in all sorts of areas. And then the priority 2, which says to promote sustainable modes of transport, including walking and cycling. So cycle from Leicester, from Hinckley to Magna Park, or from my home to probably Sharnwood. It would take me a fortnight and I'll be dead. There are no buses, there is no connectivity. And so I'm just resting, or rather shutting up on the point is that even a high level strategic document has got to have some forms of reality, achievability and tangible outcomes. Rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Page. Simon, did you want to respond to Mrs. Page's comment?
Thank you, Chair. Just to point out to the Commission that point B under paragraph 32 makes the point around the document needs to be clear on the approach to delivering the commitments set out in the strategy, including development of an action plan with partners' responsibilities and funding streams clearly identified. I think that's to Mrs. Page's point. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, Mrs. Fryer.
Thank you very much. Well, a strategy, as has been mentioned, is a strategy. It is not cast in stone and will never be changed and everything. Life moves on. If this had come to us 18 months ago, 2 years ago, we may have looked at it differently. We are very fortunate in Leicestershire. We have 3 world-class universities. We have numerous colleges of excellence. And when I first moved here many years ago from the south of England, this area was devastated by unemployment. It was I knew not a lot about Leicestershire when I moved here. It was a county I drove through to get to somewhere else. It wasn't as vital as it is now. It wasn't so important as it is. I have family and grandchildren living in France, and I have grandchildren living in the south of England. And now, whenever I mention where I come from, well, that's great. How fantastic. Now, we can't have everything. If you want a prosperous county and you want a prosperous, good living standard, you've got to have education. You've got to have high technology. Not everybody I know is going into work in Leicester. They're quite happy. And what we've learned in the last 18 months, you can do quite high-powered jobs and studying. I've got 3 relatives at university that are spending most of their time studying at home because the universities haven't worked. We are going into a completely different way of working. Internships, apprenticeships, these are coming as much a priority as working from university degrees. And I think this, yes, it needs tweaking, it needs amending, it will need doing. But I think we have to get away that the centre of the universe in this area, a 40-mile radius, is Leicester City. It isn't. It's the rest of us, market towns, university towns, colleges. And we've got to emphasise, and I have family that teach as well. You may think I've got a very large family, but who are teachers, senior teachers, headmaster, senior teachers, and they are encouraging children now, young people, to broaden the idea. It's not just to go and work in a big city or a big town. You can do so much more. And I'm very proud now that when some people say to me, where do you come from? I come from Leicestershire, and they know where I'm talking about. So carry on. It's a difficult job, but we're also looking ahead. This is a strategy for the next 9 years. There's also strategies to 2050. The world is changing. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Fryer. Simon, did you want to come back on those remarks?
No, thank you, Chair.
And Mr. Bedford, Tom, either of you want to comment? No, okay. So I've got Mr. Barclay, Mr. Hunt, and Mr. Richardson. Mr. Barclay.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. I think a lot of the comments made by Councillor Morgan I would endorse, but the conversation or debate that I've heard this morning, in honesty, is outlined in the report on page 98. Paragraph 32, sections A to I, and I think all those points are a fair observation of what could be done to improve the strategy. It is a strategy, and yes, it is difficult to encompass everything within the area, but it is the basis of a very good strategy. And I think, as we've all said this morning, and as is outlined in the report, the final document needs to be clearer on the approach to delivering the commitments set out in the strategy, including the development of an action plan with partners' responsibilities and funding streams clearly identified. I think as a template for Cabinet, the points A to I on paragraph 32 are invaluable and actually encompass what has been discussed within the chamber this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Barclay. Does anyone want to come back on Mr. Barclay's comments? No? Okay. And Mr. Hunt next.
Thank you, Chair. I do hate being contradicted by Mr. Pendleton. It goes back to our days on the Highways Committee. But 60,000 is the figure, with the opportunity to create 60,000 new skilled jobs in the East Midlands Freeport. That's on page 104. Not 6,000, it's 60,000. I know that Councillor Morgan is or has been a member of the LEP, and it's quite reasonable that you should defend it. My criticism wasn't that it was too high level or it was too low level. It's backward looking. It's not looking forward, and it's not looking at the changes that are inevitably going to be made in this county over the next so many years. I don't know what years. Oh, it goes to 2030. So we're looking in this strategy to 2030, and I'm afraid I heard nothing from Councillor Morgan to reflect that sort of forward-looking vision that a strategy is supposed to have.
Anyone wish to respond to Mr. Hunt?
Yes, if I may. New jobs, Chairman, not 60,000. They'll move in jobs, but new jobs at 6, with apologies.
Hey, I've got Mr. Richardson and Mr. Poland. Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I mean, I'll take my comments from paragraph 32, but I'd like to expand on that. So this is a draft strategy. So we've got to consider what the LEP is. The LEP is a partnership between the public and private sector to actually improve the economic viability of an area. From the debate in this council chamber this morning, I actually would be hard pressed to actually believe that Leicestershire County Council is a member of the LEP, which it is, represented by Councillor Bedford. So, we're all integral to this in terms of we've all got ownership of it. It's not them and us, it's us working together. And I think Simon's absolutely right in the comments he makes that, from a strategy, it normally develops an action plan. But until you've got a strategy, it's very difficult to have an action plan because you don't know what the actions are until you determine what the strategy is. So to me, clearly any strategy goes out for consultation to try and improve it. That's why it's out for consultation. That's why it's come to this council chamber for debate. And that's why it gives us an opportunity to put those comments forward. But I think we've got to have a difference between the nitty-gritty of an action plan and the overarching strategy that is being put forward, which has got to reflect all the areas. And therefore, what I would like to see this council do is it's fairly easy just to put down a list of things that we think are shortcomings on it, but it's not within it should be within the remit of anyone who comments on the strategy, not just to say what they think is missing, but how they think it could be covered. So I would have loved to have seen a paragraph 33, which says we've got A to I here, and these are our suggestions of how this strategy could be improved. Because I think that's within the wit of this organisation and within the wit of this council. And I would hope within the wit of anybody, and I mean corporate body, not any person, who comments on this plan. So in some ways, the debate to me should almost be about what would we suggest to Cabinet should be put forward to address these issues, which are quite rightly being raised by Simon and the Cabinet and colleagues, to make it the best possible document it has. So we've got shared ownership throughout all of the business and public sector throughout Leicester and Leicestershire, because surely that's then to the benefit of all of us. I think it's easy to throw stones at these things, but when you're a member of the organisation, you're actually throwing stones at yourself. So let's actually make it the best it can be for everybody, and let's see if we can actually expand on, as I said, paragraph 32, which I think is fully addresses the points, quite rightly, fully addresses in B, as Councillor Barclay's pointed out, that in due course there will need to be an action plan, but let's get the strategy right and let's actually work towards that in partnership, which is what the LEP is. It's a partnership of the public and private sector, and I would like this council to actually put some serious work into actually making suggestions on how the strategy could be improved.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Simon, did you want to come back on that?
I'm happy to respond. Mr. Bedford might want to go first, though. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Bedford.
Yeah, thanks, Terry, for his input, and I agree with much of what he says. I mean, I'm the representative of the county council on the board, and my approach since I joined the board back in June was that we should be a constructive friend. In the LEP, we're putting forward these comments in a constructive fashion. I know some members have commented that they feel that the comments in the report could be, beefed up or a bit more direct. But I think we are, as Terry says, a member of the LEP, so we have got to work together to make sure the strategy is the best it is. So, certainly as the county council's representative on that body, that is what I'm trying to do. So I very much subscribe to Terry's approach on this.
Thank you, Chair. And just to add, officers from all parts of the County Council have worked through numerous exercises with the consultancy developing the strategy. So, and that will continue. To Mr. Richardson's point. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Poland.
Thank you very much, Chair. Councillor Fryer spoke rightly about the importance of education to the future of our economy in the area, and I do think that is an incredibly vital point. The pandemic has shown people in a whole range of industries, areas of the economy can work from home, which in many ways is going to bring a lot of benefits. It brings benefits, obviously, to companies in terms of office costs or lack thereof, in terms of employees, in terms of work-life balance. But I don't think we should ignore the fact that there are risks from an employee's point of view as well. It's if you suddenly find that actually you can work from home, then why can you get employees that aren't 10 miles from the office? What about if they're 10,000 miles from the office? If they can work from home, it's something that we have to potentially look at and say, well, that is a potential risk if we could suddenly find the economy isn't office based anymore. So what's the value that we can use to really secure our future? And that comes back to education. You know, the knowledge, the experience that you can get from a good education is absolutely vital to really adding the value for our local people going forward, and therefore our local businesses. And let's face it, not so local businesses. Again, there's no reason why in a world where you're not working from the office that people in Leicestershire could not get jobs working for companies that are technically based in London or wherever. You know, it's that education that could be the key to the future. And linked to that, I think as well, it was talked about modern apprenticeships, and that's something I'm very, very keen on, something I support. I'm a graduate myself, and I understand the importance of university education. And degree might get you through the door of an interview. It's the experience that's going to get you the job. And having a modern apprenticeship where you can get up to degree levels and beyond master's levels in some cases, but still having that experience in industry, again, is a fabulous thing for me. I've done internships, similar things on a lower level with Leicester City Council. Actually, I'm not sure if we as an authority do. If we don't, it would be great if we could, where they take on young people to have a taster of different departments, getting that education, but also learning. So I'd really, as I said, I really wanted to second what Councillor Fryer said, and I think that's the future for our people in the 21st century.
Thank you, Mr. Poland. Simon, did you want to respond?
No, thank you, Chair.
No. And any other comments from Tom or Mr. Bedford? No. Well, thank you everyone for a very detailed debate this afternoon, and to Mr. Bedford, Tom and Simon for taking part in responding to members' questions and comments. We have one final item in the report on public engagement, which is between pages 145 to 162. Just to check, do people want to carry on through this item or have a short break? No, carry on. Okay, right. Well, we have Zafar Salim with us to introduce the report. We also have Leon, Sharika and Liz Watkins joining us online, just to check that Leon and Liz can hear us okay online. Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
And Zafar, if I hand over to you, thank you.
I wasn't quite prepared for the hot seat. This really is right in the middle. Thank you, Chair. I'm just doing an introduction because, as you can see, Tom's at home today. I'll be introducing my colleagues, Leon Sharika, who's our policy manager, together with his colleague Elizabeth Watkins, and she leads on the overall council approach to consultation and community engagement. The document that you have in front of you, they'll run through in detail and highlight some of the key areas. I think a couple of points just from me by way of introduction is that colleagues' work in two ways. First of all, they support departments themselves and services themselves to carry out consultation and engagement. So they're more the subject matter experts, and as they support a whole range of activity every year, and they'll go through that in detail. And secondly, what they also try and do is shape the council's overall culture and approach to consultation and engagement. It'd be fair to say the last 18 months has been a challenge. Clearly, in the past we would probably carry out far more face-to-face consultation, but clearly the way the restrictions are, that's not been possible, and we've had to shift a lot of consultation and engagement online, which has created some of its own challenges, in particular those who perhaps don't have access to IT, or possibly don't feel comfortable with using IT. However, what we have tried is to get round that and support as many people as possible with engagement. What we've also tried to do is, through a series of activities and workshops, work with elected members, and that's highlighted within the report, to pick up some member concerns and issues regarding the quality of engagement and the feedback to members of the public and indeed members as a result of the consultation exercises. And what we've also tried to do is benchmark using an agency called the Consultation Institute, who are the national experts on consultation, and we've asked them to come in and review what we've done. So that was by way of a short introduction, and if I could hand over to, is it Liz next or Leon?
It's me, Zafar. Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. So the purpose of today's presentation is just to reflect on some of the recent changes in the Council's approach to public engagement. You'll have received the proposed principles for consultation and engagement, as well as details on the consultation charter, which the Council is in the process of signing up to. And we welcome your thoughts on both of these documents. This presentation continues member involvement in public engagement, particularly following on from the all-member briefing, which took place in November of last year. Now, it's worth noting that the Council has an excellent reputation for doing public engagement work, and this has been recognised by the Consultation Institute, the UK's national body that Zafar referenced there. And historically, the Council has excelled at delivering high-quality formal consultations on specific changes to our policies or our services. But we're now broadening that approach, offering a range of different ways that officers can approach our communities to get feedback. And this includes a more continuous approach and using a wider range of platforms, both digital platforms, but also thinking about how we do that face-to-face, in-person work on the ground. And this broadening of the way in which we do engagement work reflects the changing relationship that the Council has to technology, the changing relationship to technology that our communities have, and the changing expectations on involvement that we see from our residents and businesses. Now, the principles document that you'll have received has been developed to improve on the existing good practice, and particularly to make improvements based on the experiences we've had over the last year. And the document will guide officers, but it's also there to reassure our communities of the sincerity and rigour of our consultation work. Our communities can use it to hold us to account. Now, those key principles you'll have seen are being inclusive, being transparent, and ensuring that our work is meaningful. And you'll have noted in paragraph 11 that we're seeing a shift towards more continuous, so more frequent, more regular engagement with our communities rather than just a one-off consultation. Closing the loop, so making sure that people know what we've heard from them and they know what the impact of that message has been on the decisions that we make. That's about building trust and making sure that our communities trust the work that we do, that it's sincere. It's also about ensuring that our officers invest time and energy in building and maintaining really good relationships with those who use our services. And we hope that this work, taken together, will shore up the goodwill towards the consultation work that we do. And as I said, build trust in that work and build faith in it. Over to you, Leon.
Thank you, Liz. I'd just like to highlight 3 aspects of the report for the Commission. First is the shift towards using digital approaches, things like online questionnaires, engagement events via MS Teams or via Zoom. As we've highlighted, there were some benefits for this. People can participate from anywhere. They just need access to a computer, iPad or smartphone to join in. And information can be spread quickly via social media. There are, of course, some drawbacks. Those without access to technology or those without the competence to use the technology may be disadvantaged, and we need to make sure that we do not leave those people behind. Secondly, whilst we really encourage strong numbers to reply to our consultations, it's also important to stress the value of the quality of the responses we receive. Understanding not only whether somebody is for and against the proposal, but their reasoning behind that and what their particular interest is. That can help us to build a relationship with those stakeholders and refine or revise our proposals accordingly. And finally, it's important that all our activity, we actively seek out the voices of all communities within Leicestershire. We need to hear particularly from those who might be affected, including minorities, marginalised or seldom held communities. We have the Leicestershire Equality Challenge Group, which helps us to do this and also provides a strong, independent a challenge to our work around equalities, and that helps us improve that. So 3 points there around digital inclusion, around the quality of access, and around ensuring we address equality issues in all our consultation and engagement work. Thank you very much for listening to our report.
Thank you, Zafar, Liz and Leon. Mr. Morgan.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you very much to all 3 of you for the introduction and also the report itself. Probably, I mean, a consultation, I suspect, is one of those things that all councillors will get contacted about at some point, quite often, because the consultee doesn't necessarily agree that the result of the consultation is as per their response. It's quite understandable. Not everyone can be right. Therefore, by default, you know, you're always going to get some people that will disagree with the outcome. I think for me, the consultation, I think, is it can either be a process that we go through purely to comply, or it can genuinely be an exercise that improves what we do. The consultation charter that I've looked at feels a bit more like a process rather than necessarily something that we look at as being a way of actually genuinely improving our outcomes. And I'm slightly fearful looking at the 7 principles, that they're principles of process rather than necessarily principles of generating or being able to actually generate better outcomes. One of the things that possibly might give residents more assurance, and I just wonder whether we actually do publish it anywhere, is maybe 5 examples, and you know, I'm sure Mrs. Taylor would be loving to be able to actually quote them. You know, sort of half a dozen examples of consultations, responses from residents that we have then used to actually improve and change our policy outcomes. And I suspect we probably have them. We probably don't necessarily quote them, or we cite them as examples. And I just wonder whether that might give people more comfort that our consultation exercises have a meaningful outcome. And we talk about that as something that we support. Being able to actually demonstrate it with examples may actually be one way of being able to actually give people comfort that we are genuinely interested in their responses, rather than just this is just a process that we're going through. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Zafar, did you wish to respond?
Yeah, I think that's a very valuable and fair point. I think there is always a challenge by answering that, well, closing that loop is we asked, you said, and we did. We do have tangible examples which we could use to perhaps reassure those who participated in consultation, but also elected members as well. And certainly we roughly, there's around, I'm looking at Liz and Leon now, about 20 plus large scale consultations every year, as well as the individual service ones. So I would think it'd be reasonably easy to publicize them and maybe turn them into case studies, and that would actually give that reassurance that communities are looking for.
Thank you, Zafar. Did Liz or Leon want to add anything to that?
Yeah, if I could just chip in there. Just so a couple of things. Firstly, to follow on from Zafar's comments about how we feed back to communities about what we've heard and what impacts that's had. We're in the process of redeveloping some of our web pages that focus on consultation, and we plan to state there for each piece of work we do what we've heard, what we've done as a result, what the impact has been of the feedback we've heard. So I would hope that I can point those to you, Mr. Morgan, once they're live, and you and other councillors can refer to them and point your constituents towards them to see in detail what's been the result of the feedback they've given, and there'll be contact details there for the relevant officers should they want more information. Just on the consultation charter, I agree with you that it's a very process-orientated document, but I think that's because in a way, for when you're guiding officers and when you're guiding those people who are involved in operational level, it's telling people or suggesting the best way of going about doing consultation is often the best way to get that good outcome. So what we do is we try and shape the process that officers follow, because that tends to be the easiest way of ensuring that the outcomes that we want, those really high quality bits of work, that's how we get them. So I think perhaps what that document doesn't really state very clearly is that if we do the work in the best possible way, by following the best possible process and the best practice in those areas, that's how you ensure that the information that we get, the relationships that we build, are the best possible ones. So I think that those two things are really closely linked here, process and outcome. And by following best practice with process, that's how you get the best outcomes, if that's clear.
Thank you, Liz. Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. I think we do some extraordinary good consultation. I mean, there's, in my role as Chair of Adults Communities, some of the consultation we've done around care homes now, I think has been extraordinarily good, done very sympathetically and done very well. What I'm more concerned about is the wider scale consultation. So I think the last time, for instance, we had the MTFS consultation, I think if I'm right, we got 256 responses or something, of which 180 were from staff. Now, out of a county of 700,000 people, that represents a return of, I suspect, around about 0.02% without working it out, which is statistically pointless. We might as well have not bothered doing it. I know we have to do it. So the question is, what I don't sense from these documents is how do we increase the response to those? So what lessons do we learn from perhaps the second tier of local government, who have extraordinarily far better returns on their consultations than we do here at county? So I didn't sense in this how we're going to increase that level of response to make it statistically representative. I mean, we went to some workshops now, I recall, God, a long while ago, prior to pandemic it must have been, life has moved on, where we talked about such things of how do we get out to the wider public. I didn't sense that any of, or a lot of that, is reflected in these documents about how do we do it. So I think, as I said, I think the very personal ones, the ones which in some ways are probably the most important, we do very, very well. So this is not a criticism or consultation. And I don't think any of us know the answer, but how do we get the wider public to comment on what we do? And sometimes I think we just ignore the simple way. So, you know, we've all got free magazines in our areas, but I've never seen the county have an advert in one of the free magazines like the Journal. I've never seen the county go out to the district councils and say, could you get these bin hangers put on your dustbin? Because trust me, the biggest response you'll ever get is from a bin hanger, because people pick it up and they respond. So let's use all of the methods we can rather than relying on digital and somebody looking at our website. And you know, if you're going to do that on the website, and this may sound awful criticism, I don't mean it to do, I don't think our website is as user-friendly as it could be, particularly when you look at other councils, particularly other upper tier councils and unitary authorities. So I think there's a fair bit more work we could do there, where you could actually put on page 1 consultations or something and actually look at it. So I'd just like to see more in these documents about the how we're going to achieve it. And then, you know, to me, what is the point of bringing a report to this council that documents people's responses if they account to 0.02%? We might as well just say, statistically, we've not had enough responses, therefore we're not bothering giving them to you, to save all that time in analysing responses, which, quite frankly, statistically are meaningless.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Zafar, did you want to respond?
Again, a fair point on statistical relevance and documentation. It's always difficult for something like MTFS because most people can't relate to it. It's not tangible, which is different from, say, a parish council setting its precept. You know, people can see that it means something to them, and potentially at a district level as well. When obviously the equivalent Section 151 officer sets obviously the council tax. So there have been other larger scale consultation exercises, such as a walking strategy. I think that was, which was led by ENT, and that did generate a significant amount, certainly into the thousands. But again, I'd agree with you. A county of this size, 700,000 population, that is always going to be a challenge, and whether there is a solution to that, I certainly can't think of one at the moment. But you are right, at the other end, that one-to-one consultation where it's affecting you in terms of your care plan or something else, it's reassuring to know that is happening and that is being done well. So Leon or Liz, I don't know if you got anything.
Yes, I think Mr. Richardson raises a very, very good point. We have moved again more towards looking at continuous engagement. Things like focus groups have worked really well on things like the cycling and walking strategy. And equally, when we did some small scale focus groups around the MTFS, they were very productive as well, not just in terms of getting the responses, yes, do you agree with this or not, but what are your priorities for the area you live in, what's important to you, what's important about the services you receive from the council. So we're just trying to move away from one-off consultations where the numbers may well be low to more continuous engagement and better understanding of the communities that we serve.
If I could just add to that, Mr. Chair, just to say that I think Mr. Richardson is right to point out that some of the high-level work that we do, some of those kind of broader strategies that we put out to consultation, do struggle to grab people. And I think there's an onus on us then as officers to relate that work to our constituents, to our communities. My mantra to staff is always to make it personal or to make it practical. And I think we've got to think going forwards about the way in which we frame the consultation activity we do. We've also got to think about how we link it in with other work that people might have a prior interest in. So aligning some of our consultation activities so that we get a broader exposure to communities, and we can draw out the practicalities of the thing we're talking about. We're also looking at redeveloping our website or the web pages related to consultation, as I mentioned in the comment to Mr. Morgan. And whilst we are concerned with the number of people that respond, we're also keen to look at the quality of those responses. We may have quite a small number in some cases, statistically speaking, but nevertheless, some of those comments are rich and helpful. And I think it's important to ensure that we do remember that it's quality and not just quantity that we're interested in here. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I just wanted to come back on that comment on focus groups, for instance. So I've lived in the county 33 years now. I've been a county councillor for 6 years. I've never seen a focus group in my local area, ever. There's not one ever taken place in my division. We could have a focus group on the MTFS at the parish council meetings that are coming up at budget time. You get a really good thing because the parish council would advertise it for you there. And I do disagree slightly. I mean, the problem with if we go solely on qualitative responses is you end up pandering to the vocal minority as opposed to what the majority want if we're not careful. So I accept they can be very rich and useful, but I do think we have to take them in the context of they might reflect the views of a very, very small minority, not the majority, because statistically we haven't got enough to tell us what the majority wants. So I do think we could do a lot more if we're going to do continuous, because I've never seen it in my area. I don't know if a focus group has ever happened in my division. If it has, I've never been told as a county councillor it's happening.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Did anyone want to respond to Mr. Richardson's follow-up?
Again, it's certainly I've no reservations at all about going out with Declan or Chris Tambini to various community groups, parish or town councils, and potentially other groups to certainly on something as specific as the council MTFS, because ultimately it is several hundreds of millions of pounds that we are going to spend, so it does have that overall impact, and it's right and proper to consult parish and town councils and other stakeholder groups. So again, we can I can take that back to with colleagues and certainly build something in. Ultimately, it is obviously I'll have to pick that with, as I said, Chris Tambini, and see what the appetite is. Yeah. But we can build that in. It doesn't necessarily have to be paper and online. It can be face to face.
Okay, Mr. Hunt.
Thank you. I found this report much more interesting than I expected, actually, and I particularly valued the discussion about engagement versus consultation, and I hadn't quite realised, the nuances there, perhaps. And as councillors, we're all deeply involved in consultation right from the start, with typically planning applications, which are in themselves, a fundamentally consultative practice. The particular issue that I felt wasn't covered as much as I'd liked from our point of view as a council is where the decision point is made in matters that we're consulting on. Now, typically, if a service is going to be remodelled, a consultation takes place. Often the local members concerned, or there are scrutiny committees concerned, but the decision is made by the cabinet. Ultimately, that's correct. What we as consultees then reflect on is, were they asking the right questions, or had they made the decision before they set the questions? And that's the biggest issue that I find always comes up in this council, that, well, a consultation would say that, wouldn't it? Because it's the way you've asked the question, or if you'd asked it differently, you would have got a different result. And I think the only way of avoiding that is by being, and I think you hinted it in your paper, I'm looking at page 154, that sort of area, with the detailed points, is by being absolutely clear right from the beginning what you're consulting on and what you're not consulting on. And sometimes it's difficult to explain that, because until you're close to the subject, it's difficult to know. But that really is the most important thing, I think, in this authority. But thank you very much for a brilliant report.
Thank you, Mr. Hunt. Does anyone want to respond to Mr. Hunt's comments?
I'd just like to thank Mr. Hunt for those really positive responses to the report. And it is absolutely right that we do need to think very carefully when we start a consultation what we are consulting on and what we're not consulting on. what decisions are up for influence and which ones aren't up for influence, and then following the process to make sure we get meaningful responses coming back. So making sure we're very clear about the information we're giving out, the timescales are appropriate for people to respond, and we take into account all the feedback that we've received, and we close the loop by making sure we let people know how their information, how their views have been taken into account in reaching the final decision. We may not follow their advice, but we need to demonstrate that we've heard what they've said. Thank you.
If I could just follow on from that, just to say that I agree wholeheartedly with Mr. Hunt's point that the questions that you ask, the way in which you ask those questions is essential here. And I think we're very lucky as a council to have a business intelligence service who are able to provide us with real expertise as to how to frame questions and how to collect responses to those questions in ways that avoid bias, that avoid being leading, and that fully capture what people have said and who said it in a way that gives us a very granular and very clear understanding of what people think. So yeah, I think I take the point that how we ask questions in consultation is very important. I think we're lucky that we have an extremely good service that can provide expertise on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other contributions members wish to make? Mrs. Taylor.
Thank you. I just think it's been a really good discussion, actually. And I think there's several of us in this room. I think if you asked each one of us how we'd want to respond to a consultation, we'd probably all have different answers. So I think it's a very wide subject, to be honest. So, but I think it needs to be relatable to the residents' personal circumstances. And I think that's the key to consultation and continuous consultation. I think in a previous life, I used to work for the Office for National Statistics. I used to go out interviewing people all the time, and that continuous influx of data guides you towards what the residents want. So going out once a year on the MTFS has no relevance to anyone. But if you ask everyone, a bunch of residents every week, what they thought of the services and what we're providing, you probably get a much better answer. So I think the way we do things, definitely we need to continuously update, but I think more continuous consultation rather than one-off consults seems to be the way to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Taylor. Final call for speakers. Anybody else wish to make any comments? No, any final comments from Liz, Leon or Zafar? No. Well, no. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for presenting today, and thank you for members, and thank you to everybody who's participated in all the items on debate today. So item 13 is the date of the next meeting, which is scheduled to take place on the 8th of September 2021. Again, due to the number of items on the agenda, we'll start at the earlier time of 10 a.m. and an afternoon slot will be added to your diaries in case we can't deal with all the items in the morning session. Updated invites will be sent to you in due course. So thank you very much, everybody, for your participation today. It's appreciated, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.